All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. We had about 100 people in the weight room, so we're going to give them just a few seconds to get situated. It's a bit of a cold morning. We planned this way back in October without thinking we would be in a snowstorm. We understand that might affect participation today. Please take care of yourselves. Plenty of hot tea, hot chocolate, coffee, whatever you need for this morning. All right, so we're gonna make sure if y'all want to test the chat feature that it's working for everyone. But we're also going to be utilizing our Q&A box because we do have such a large webinar. We have about 250 people signed up to join us this morning. We may or may not get to that number, but to keep things organized, we're using the Q&A section, especially for questions and comments for our speaker today. And then we will kind of just have general chat in the chat box. Denise Loya is going to be on for part of this morning, helping me monitor that as we get situated. And then we will really focus in on the Q&A box as we move forward. Today's session is going to run just a little bit differently. Today is a two-part session, so there will be a break. We understand with weather, life, walk-ins, appointments, things like that, not everybody may be able to stay for both parts today. So we will take a break and then that will start our second part this morning. So we will be here until lunchtime today. Both sessions are being recorded. We are going to make those available on our YouTube page. Takes us about 2 weeks to get those up. So if you can't stay for part two, we totally understand. I will put the training evaluation up twice. So if you do need to leave early, if you don't mind taking that training evaluation before you go, that would be fantastic. So, all right. So I see a lot of chatter, lots of places. I love watching where everybody's calling in from. It's one of my favorite parts of webinar hosting. So, because we get people joining us from all over the world. So we never know who's going to hang out with us. So. All right, so looks like we are in. We want to utilize our time today because I know we have a ton of content. I'm Crystal Garcia, for those of y'all who haven't seen me host a webinar. I am the Community Education Specialist here at TASA, and I am going to be moderating today's session. So just a few housekeeping things that we want to take care of before we move into our content with our speaker. We have some great things coming up in terms of webinars. We will be having a webinar with Nova during the month of February that will be discussing campus work with people who are also connected to the military. That's going to be a great topic. And then after that, we do want y'all to save the date. After that session in February, we will be opening up registration for a four-part series that will be conducted over the entire month of March. That session is going to be moderated and hosted by Rose Luna, TASA's CEO. Those sessions will actually take place on Tuesday morning. So we wanted to make y'all aware we will not be following our normal Friday schedule in the month of March because we will have a special series with Rose and lots of TASA staff and a few other special guests. Our topic for that month will be legislation and action. We will be talking about all the new legislation that was passed and how the skills that we need to implement those changes to better serve survivors under the new laws in Texas. So there will be 4 sections on that. Those will take place on Tuesday mornings. Registration for that will open up during the last week of February. So if you're not signed up for our mailing list, watching our social media channels to get signed up for those sessions, go ahead and save the date, but make sure that you are connected so we can get you to those sessions. Those should be all of our sessions, the February session and the March series, should be really helpful topics for us as advocates working in Texas. So a few other details that people have had some questions about during registration. Continuing education. Today's session will be eligible for 3 hours of continuing education. We will only be issuing one certificate. So if you do part one and don't stay for part two, you will claim 1.5 training hours. If you stay for both parts, you will be eligible to claim all 3 hours. Our certificates are able to be used for multiple purposes if you're reporting hours to the Behavioral Education Council. And I know there's a new system for them that became effective, and lots of people are starting to use it this month. You will need to upload that document, the completed document, and claim your hours. TASA does meet the criteria under the 50-50 rule for those of y'all that are having to report in for licensure. If you are just an advocate and you are needing to send in maybe to a supervisor or your program director or something like that, just proof of attendance and training completion today, you will utilize the same continuing education certificate, following the same hours in terms of keeping it on file for audit, saving it, completing it and submitting to your supervisor. You just won't submit to the Behavioral Education Council. So the certificate serves a dual purpose. It's both a proof of participation and the document that you need to submit to claim formal licensing continuing education hours. So advocates who just need to meet a certain training criteria can utilize those certificates. So if you're in need of either situation, we are happy to help you. But the certificate serves both purposes. If you are credentialing a national organization or something like that, and need a different type of form that is connected to, say, for example, Nova or something like that, if you could just email me a copy of that certificate or that particular paperwork, and we can get that filled out and sent back to you. So I will put my email in the chat box, and we can get that all taken care of. So with that, I believe that is all of our housekeeping. We are happy to welcome Natalie Ivey from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. I'm so grateful to be hosting this training during Stalking Awareness Month. This is such an underreported and still continually misunderstood topic in Texas. For quite some time now, advocates have been saying our training on this is out of date. It doesn't match with what we're seeing now in the field. Things have evolved with technology, with social media, with the public knowing everything about us now. So I'm so grateful that we can host a 2-part session to bring our training up to date, to bring our skills up to date, and kick off the year with some really good particular content. So I'm going to turn it over to Natalie, and y'all have a great webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Crystal. I am super excited to be chatting with y'all today and hoping everybody stays warm and safe as you guys are facing the storm. We're going to get it about 24 hours after y'all, so we'll be keeping an eye on everything. But as we jump into stalking, as Crystal mentioned, we oftentimes are training communities, training individuals, responders. It's kind of weird. I feel a little bit comforted that the responses our training is out of date because a lot of times we're going to communities and there hasn't even been training relative to stalking. Stalking is one of those issues that we oftentimes are overlooking, and we're not giving that same level of intentionality that we do for other types of crimes like intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking. To that end, I will say, and you'll hear throughout this training, it inevitably becomes kind of a parade of all of the mistakes I've made in my career, hoping that you can learn from it and do better. But just to give some context about my perspective and how I approach this work, I started my professional career prosecuting domestic and sexual violence crimes in Tennessee and rural communities in Tennessee, and did that for a period of time and then shifted into the victim service world. So I worked in victim service agencies that supported victims of domestic and sexual violence, and then a little bit more extensively human trafficking. And I say that to kind of set the stage for maybe some of the experience or expertise that some of y'all are bringing to the table here today. I love seeing all of the folks introducing themselves, a lot of advocates. And I'm going to make an assumption that you guys have, the experience and kind of the perspective of working within some of those other dynamics, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, human trafficking. Um, we as advocates, as prosecutors and law enforcement, we might oftentimes feel kind of fluent in those dynamics. And we think of stalking as kind of this totally different, unique, foreign concept. What we will see here today, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We will see here, and we're going to talk about over the next couple hours, these concepts, what drives stalking, what ways that we can respond to stalking. They're not novel. They're not unique. They're actually really, really similar to these other forms of power and control. So there's a part of it that's familiar to us, and we know that we have the tools and the skills to respond to it. But the other side of that is we have to make sure that we're responding to it with that same level of intentionality, of support, of kind of planning on the front end. We think about how our communities and our support systems are set up to support victims of other types of crime. We want to make sure that stalking has that same level of intentionality in our communities. So we work for the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. If you're not familiar with us, I would encourage you to take a look at our site. We are federally funded, which essentially means that we are here, we are paid, we are funded to offer support services to responders in the field. So advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, medical professionals, any kind of professional who has the potential to be working and responding to victims of stalking in their professional capacity. Really, we hope that serves as a little, breath of fresh air, right? A little bit of relief. Having been in the field, I know what it feels like to be overworked and under-resourced. And so we want you to know we are here to help you. We can do trainings. We've got all kinds of profession-specific resources on our site. We have our trainings on our site, and our goal is to make them as accessible as possible for you. So hopefully that's something you can kind of put in your back pocket and use down the road. I will say the other side of the federal funding is, if I go off the rails here in the next couple hours, I don't think it's going to be an issue, but should I, you can't hold the federal government liable for this presentation here today. So just to be very clear about that. But you can check out all that we have to offer there on our site, and you'll hear me kind of referencing back to our resources pretty regularly. Again, hopefully the goal here is that we're going to make all of your jobs a little bit easier, right? Hopefully we can help reduce the lift on what it takes to respond to stalking. So let's jump into some content. When we talk about stalking, when we are really kind of coming to this topic, we want to be very clear and be grounded in the reality of stalking. We see stalking, as I've already said, kind of seen as a side issue, maybe a less than important issue. But what we actually know to be true about stalking, when we look at the data, when we look at the statistics, we see that this form of abuse is very closely correlated to very lethal outcomes. So we know the actual outcomes can be incredibly violent and cause harm to victims and harm to our communities at large. But when we talk about the experience of stalking, I think this quote from a researcher that we partner with really closely, Dr. Brady, really sums up what the victims of stalking are experiencing. This, again, form of abuse is incredibly effective in creating real terror, real impact in victims' lives. And so we want to make sure we're approaching this content with the gravity that it deserves, that we are being honest about what this actually means and what this represents in our community. We see stalking sometimes getting entwined with harassment. We'll unpack that in a little bit, right? Annoying behaviors. We see the kind of even the term stalking being used casually, right? We use it incorrectly, we as a society, right? We talk about, oh my gosh, I saw you were on vacation. I was totally stalking your Instagram, right? And when we do that, when we fail to understand the actual impact, we are really overlooking how this is causing harm to victims. And I'll give kind of a perspective. When we think about words that, terms that represent harm, that represent violence, maybe the word rape, we're not using the word rape casually, right? We're not using the word rape incorrectly. We are recognizing that word has gravity. It's powerful, right? It's something that we kind of hold in abeyance. But when we talk about stalking, we fail sometimes to really understand how this is impacting the victims. And we also have to acknowledge that we're not seeing the whole picture. When we talk about our response to stalking within a community, our support system, we sometimes can be a little bit, our logic can be kind of work backwards, right? What's the problem in our community? Now let's figure out a way to solve it. If we take that approach, how many stalking victims do we have in our community? Well, let's figure out what resources or support systems we need. If we take that approach, we will fail to see the actual problem in our community. We will not really appreciate or understand how many of our community members, our friends, our neighbors, our family members are experiencing this dynamic. Because a little bit uniquely to those other crimes that I've mentioned, we know that stalking victims, the majority of stalking victims, are not even reporting their experience. So we want to, that can be a little bit heavy, frankly. If you are a helper, if you're a responder, it's easy to kind of see that data and be like, well, gosh, well, how can I help if nobody's asking for help? But we really need to take that in and let it inform our way of approaching and addressing this issue. We have to create space. We have to be preemptive, proactive about starting the conversation so that victims feel empowered to report, that they know that this is a place that their disclosure will be received, will be taken seriously, that they can get help and they can get support, right? So it really kind of speaks to the responsibility that we have, again, as a system, as a society, to approach this issue with some real intentionality. And as I mentioned earlier, the lethal outcomes, we'll dig into some of those risk assessments with some specificity in a bit. But when we talk about just the data behind stalking behaviors, particularly within intimate partner violence, we see a really close correlation with homicide, intimate partner homicide, and we're going to see an even closer correlation with intimate partner femicide. So we know, again, our data is telling us this is a dynamic. These are behaviors we need to be paying attention to. So what is stalking? You've heard me kind of already talk about all the things it isn't, right? When we use it casually in conversation, when we talk about, oh, I was checking out your vacation pictures, we know that's not actually stalking, right? We also kind of want to address this surface level explanation of stalking. We see so often with stalkers, they will excuse their behavior or they will explain their behavior by saying, I'm so in love, I'm just obsessed, I have a fascination, a fixation on this person, right? We see it kind of associated with obsession, almost associated with like a complimentary approach, right? Gosh, I just love them so much. I can't let them go. We want to be really careful about that when we talk about what stalking actually is and what's motivating stalking. This is kind of the correlation I think of. And if you've been doing work in gender-based violence, you maybe can relate to this. I remember a long, long time ago when I was working as a prosecutor, oftentimes we were assigning individuals who had been convicted of domestic violence, we were assigning them to anger management. That was the resource we had in our community, right? And it was kind of like this surface level analysis of what is happening. They lost their temper on Saturday night and they hit their partner, right? They must have an anger problem. We were looking at that surface level presentation. we really were not using our critical thinking to see the entire picture, right? Because so often when we are talking about individuals who engage in domestic violence, those individuals are actually typically pretty incredible at controlling their anger, right? They do not lose their temper with bosses. They do not lose their temper when they are coaching the little league team or when they're serving in their local church, right? They're actually incredibly intentional about who they choose to lose their temper with, right? Because we know now this isn't about anger, it's about power and control. Anger is a tool, but it's about power and control. And the same is true with stalking. This is not about love. It is not about obsession. It's not about extreme fascination. When we are talking about actual stalking behaviors, we're talking about an individual who is exerting power and control over another. This is a form of intentional abuse. This is not an accidental crime that somebody might commit because they just happen to love someone too much. So we want to be really careful about that. We want to be really specific when we are analyzing and looking for stalking behaviors, and certainly not letting our perspective, our response kind of be watered down by these abusers' excuses for their behaviors, right? So when we talk about stalking, we kind of guide it, we build it on these three principles. First and foremost, it's criminal, it's traumatic, and it's dangerous. And it's certainly a crime that deserves our attention. So let's dig into each of those a little bit. Mainly because I know everybody's favorite thing to do, first thing on a Friday morning, is read legal statutes, right? I'm sure you guys would be doing that even if you weren't on this webinar. It's one of the most enjoyable things a person can do. Obviously not. We're going to dig into that though, and we're going to try to make it as digestible as possible, and we'll get it out of the way, right? We won't spend a lot of time in the law books, but it's really important for us. All right, Hannah, you love him. I like it. It's important for us to understand our laws, right? And to feel comfortable with what our laws say, because we can have the best statutes, written that are incredibly comprehensive and incredibly effective, but they mean nothing if we don't know how to use them. And so we want to make sure all of our partners in our community understand what are the legal elements behind stalking. And not only so that we can hold offenders accountable, but also that we can improve communication among partners. I don't know about y'all, but so often I hear from folks in the field who are having this breakdown of communication. I might hear from an advocate who says, I'm working with a victim and law enforcement won't do anything, right? Or we might hear from law enforcement, hey, I am reporting on stalking cases and prosecution won't do any, the prosecutors won't take these cases, won't try them. So often when we start digging into the detail of that, those attitudes and those feelings really inhibit partnership. They inhibit our ability to support victims because we start to just break down, right? But if we start to dig into it, we'll see and we'll start to identify, oh, here's what we're missing within the statute, right? Or we have a misunderstanding of the statute. So all that to say, we want everyone to feel comfortable so we can talk openly about it. If an advocate is bringing, supporting a victim and going to law enforcement, it feels much less stigmatizing and disorienting if the law enforcement officer says, I hear you, I see you, here's the element we're missing. Otherwise, we would charge stalking, right? That feels easier to digest than we can't do anything. We're not going to help you, right? If they're receiving that message, that becomes incredibly stigmatizing. So we want to make sure, again, we all feel really comfortable about this. This is where your stalking statute lives, if you didn't know already. And I will fully own, I consider myself, though I was an attorney, I consider myself a recovering attorney, okay? I can fully accept and admit nobody likes reading statutes. Maybe Hannah does, but for the most part, nobody likes reading legal statutes. They are complex, they are complicated, they're boring. They're boring, right? And when we start to dig into these, it's easy kind of for our eyes to glaze over and for us to feel like, oh my gosh, there's no way I can carry this around with me. I can't memorize these things. I want us to look at it in general, kind of a broad perspective, and then we're going to take it bite by bite. And hopefully the bites will be easier to carry with us, and we will feel like we understand the statute in its structure, right? Kind of the skeleton of the statute. So I do want to point out here in our stalking statute, sorry, let me go back really quick. The first part here is talking about that course of conduct, and this is what the statute breaks down when it talks about what could be considered in that course of conduct. The first behaviors that can be considered part of the course of conduct are offenses that fall under Section 4207. If you don't know what 4207 is, that's your harassment statute, okay? So if somebody is engaging in harassing behaviors, those behaviors absolutely can be considered part of the course of conduct. Or behaviors that the offender knows or reasonably should know that the victim, the other person, will regard as threatening. And the things that can be considered threatening are if it's reasonable that it would threaten injury, right? Reasonable that it would threaten injury to someone in kind of the victim's universe, right? In their support system. Reasonable that it would threaten the victim's property. Those can all be considered a course of conduct. So we know the second part of this statute. We have the first part is the course of conduct where the offender knows or should know. The second part is that it causes some harm, right? We're going to look at the impact. It causes the victim to be placed in fear. They do feel worried about it. And finally, it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So let's break this down. We're already kind of getting into, this is a long statute. It's a very comprehensive statute, which is great. But we want to break it down and make sure we're understanding it. Sarah, I see your question about threatening someone's career. If you will put that in the Q&A, if you don't mind, so that way I don't forget it, but let's talk about that in just a minute. That's a great question, and that's a really clever one, right? So when we talk about big picture buckets of these statutes, right? When we talk about these bites that we want to walk away with, the first thing that we want to acknowledge as responders, no matter what our role is that very first element was a course of conduct, right? Remember, we saw it right here on more than one occasion and pursuant to the same scheme or course of conduct. That concept is not overly complicated, but it's really, really important that we understand how this causes us to fail to see stalking. Because so often, our systems are incident respondent, right? We are designed to respond to whatever is bringing someone to our door. We're going to solve that problem. They have property damage. We're going to respond to that. They need a place to stay, emergency housing. We're going to respond to that. They have a medical issue, that's bringing them into the ER. We're going to respond to that. We are an incident respondent system in general. So what happens is with stalking is we as responders, we're responding to that incident and we never identify the course of conduct. And the response sometimes from responders is like, well, the victim never told me that it was a part of a course of conduct. How would I know, right? But let's walk through this a little bit. We'll walk through how this plays out. Let's say a victim, maybe a college student, they've broken up with a partner. The partner's behavior is escalating, is getting threatening. They're sending kind of these ominous text messages. The ex-partner is now like showing up at the cafeteria the same time the victim's there. The victim's getting really, really uncomfortable, right? Things are getting intense. The victim doesn't know what they're experiencing as stalking. They don't know what they're experiencing as a course of conduct, right? They're just thinking, oh gosh, I hope this de-escalates. Let's say that victim walks out of class and all 4 tires on their vehicle are slashed, right? They call campus police. Campus police responds. And in that moment, as they are talking to campus police and they are thinking about, first and foremost, the trauma, right? Oh my gosh, this has really escalated. I am terrified now. What else is going to happen, right? They're processing all of that. They're also processing the logistics of their crime, the crime they've just experienced, right? I don't have a vehicle now. I can't afford 4 new tires. I'm not going to be able to get to work. I'm going to lose my job. If I lose my job, I'm going to have to find somewhere else to live, right? They're thinking through all of those things. And so while they are managing all of this in their head, if they don't say to the officer, oh, by the way, officer, these tires being slashed are also part of a course of conduct. Here are the other things that happened, and here's the proof I have to show that those things occurred. If they don't do that, the officer, incredibly well intentioned, might take a very robust report about the tires being slashed. And if you ask that officer later that day, hey, did you have any stalking cases on campus today? The officer's going to tell you, no, no, we didn't have any, right? If we told the officer, actually, that person was a victim of stalking, the officer's response might be, well, they never told me. We as a system, again, I'm making generalizations, but we as a system, we oftentimes are waiting for the victim to bring this to our door instead of looking for it actively. Oftentimes, I tell law enforcement and advocates that, when we are responding to an incident, we want to make sure that we are proving to ourselves that it's not stalking rather than waiting for the victim to prove to us that it is, if that makes sense, right? We want to approach this response with some real focus to make sure that there are not other things going on that could fall within that course of conduct. Now, one thing I really want to point out here is sometimes our statutes have some definitions and some explanations of what all can be included within these kind of legal terms of art. So this does live in your statute. It clarifies that a trier of fact may find that different types of conduct described by subsection A, if engaged in on more than one occasion, can constitute conduct that is engaged in pursuant to the same scheme or course of conduct. So that's just helpful for us to know. It's giving clear direction that different types of behaviors, even if they're occurring at different times and sometimes maybe even duplicating, those all can be considered part of that course of conduct. So you've heard me say course of conduct about 15 times now. What does that mean? What is a course of conduct? What are we including in, our analysis of stalking behaviors? We really think it's helpful for our responders to think about stalking behaviors within what we call this SLY framework. This was established by a researcher that we partner with really closely. And the goal behind the SLY framework is kind of the same as, again, if you've been in this field long, you maybe can relate to this moment of learning, in the industry. But a long time ago, there used to be this assumption or these stereotypes that intimate partner violence was only physical violence, right? It was a black eye, it was a broken arm. That's the only way it presented. And then when we had the power and control wheel come out, it really helped us understand all the ways someone can engage in intimate partner violence. The SLY framework similarly can help us understand all the ways someone can engage in stalking behaviors. And it really helps us start to see how this is a cycle of power and control, how this builds on itself, it grows, and frankly, is incredibly effective. It's an effective form of abuse. So when we talk about this first category, this surveillance category, this is essentially the offender gathering information about the victim for the purpose of causing future harm. That last part is incredibly crucial, right? Because you've already heard me say, we talk about stalking behaviors. We talk about, gathering information as stalking behaviors. If you were going on a blind date with someone, or maybe not a blind date, you wouldn't know who that was, but say you're going on a date with a new person, right? If you are hiring someone to work in your home, maybe a contractor, if there is someone that you are bringing into your life, there is a high likelihood that you're going to, learn about them, check up on them, figure out what's out there, right? You might do some due diligence in gathering information about them. That's not stalking. Stalking is gathering information for the purpose of causing future harm. Stalkers are not gathering information about their victims because they're curious. They want to know if the victim is a safe person. They're interested in where the victim vacations. They are gathering that information because they want to be able to weaponize it later. So, what type of information do you think a stalker might be gathering about a victim? This is not a trick question. We're just going to warm up your fingertips. You can come off mute if you want to, if you're brave enough, or you can throw it in the chat. Who their employer is, absolutely, where they work, where they live. Yeah, family, who they live with. Absolutely. All correct answers. Hobbies, what they drive, friends. Absolutely. I mean, we probably could sit and do this for hours, right? All of this information can be used and weaponized later. There can be logistical information, right? The routine, the routes, all of those things. It can be relational information, who their friends are, who their families are. Are they up for a promotion? Hold on, I got a cough. Ooh, sorry. All of that stuff can be very, very valuable. Yeah, and y'all are still rolling with it, right? The offender can be gathering information about that victim for all of those purposes. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we move through it, but when we are screening for stalking behaviors, when we're asking the victim about what they've experienced, there's a really good chance that a victim does not know about the surveillance stage, right? This can be happening without the victim ever knowing. So we just want to be aware of that so that if we are asking the victim, are you experiencing surveillance? And the victim says no, it doesn't mean that surveillance isn't happening, right? So something to think about when we talk about identifying these behaviors. But you guys are spot on, right? All of those things can be helpful for the stalker in terms of causing real harm in that victim's life. So our second category is life invasion. This is essentially where that stalker, that offender, is starting to exert power and control over the victim. And that stalker is essentially saying, hey, I'm going to be part of your life whether you want me to be or not. You are going to have to think about me. You're going to have to deal with me. I'm going to be on your radar. I'm going to be on your mind. I'm going to take up some of your energy, right? And they communicate this a number of ways. Sometimes it's excessive phone calls, text messages, it's showing up at the same place where the victim is, it's sitting on the park bench across from the victim's office, it's sending gifts, it's making sure that their presence is known to the victim. The really difficult thing for us is all of those behaviors I just described, are any of them on the surface or by themselves illegal? Is it illegal to sit on a park bench? Of course not. To go to the grocery store? Of course not. To send a gift? It's not illegal, right? So these behaviors get really difficult for us to identify, to recognize as abuse, as a crime. It can be really, really hard and really, really isolating for that victim. But it's a really effective way to start to exert that power and control, just maybe to help us relate to that experience. If you think about any time you've ended a relationship or maybe quit a job, maybe there's a time where you thought, gosh, this is just not serving me anymore. I don't want to do this. I want to be done, right? Let's say you quit a bad job, you got a bad boss, and you think, I do not want to have to deal with this anymore. How would you feel if on the first day of your new job, you walk in and the bad boss is sitting in the lobby, right? Just waiting for you to show up. Hey, I'm still here. You're still going to have to deal with me, right? So we see how that can start to really take away that control in the victim's life, right? It starts to expose them to that abuser's kind of will, right? This third category, this intimidation, is where that abuser is essentially saying, not only am I going to be part of your life, you're going to have to deal with me, you're going to have to think about me, but you should actually fear me because I can cause real harm in your life. I can hurt you. I can hurt your family. I can hurt your friends. I can hurt your career, right? I can hurt your pets. I can hurt I can cause actual harm or impact in your life. Now, when we talk about these intimidation behaviors, sometimes they are overt. We certainly have stalkers who say, I'm going to hurt you, right? Sometimes with our intimidation behaviors, we have, particularly with current or former intimate partners, we have what we kind of consider to be symbolic violence. And that gets really hard, really tricky for us as outsiders to recognize. I'll give you a quick example. But if we had a victim of intimate partner violence who, while she was in the violent relationship, maybe her abuser regularly made threats. And these threats happened when things were getting particularly violent, right? When the victim was fearing for her life. The abuser might maybe told the victim, I'm going to kill you one day. And when I do, I'm going to put a dozen white roses on your grave. I hope your mom loves white roses because that's what she's going to see every time she comes to your grave. I will kill you, right? This is a threat, a refrain that the victim hears regularly. Let's say the victim flees that relationship, moves to another town, is living in a place they think is safe and secure and confidential, and they show up for their first day of work at their new job, and what's sitting on their desk? A dozen white roses, right? What is everyone around that victim doing? When they see the flower delivery, how are the victim's coworkers, new coworkers, reacting? Again, not a trick question. Yeah, fawning, right? Oh my gosh, you're so lucky. I wish somebody would do that for me, right? They're excited. They're making over it. Everyone's having a positive reaction to this delivery, right? What is the victim experiencing? A pretty clear and extreme death threat. I know where you are. I'm coming to find you. I'm going to kill you. Think about those two responses. They could not be farther apart, right? What everyone around them is experiencing and what the victim is experiencing. And just to be really clear, the only way for the victim to get her coworkers to understand what she's experiencing, the victim has to disclose information that's incredibly personal to her, right? Actually, I was in an abusive relationship and, she has to tell the whole story just so her coworkers can say, "Oh, yeah, I don't want those flowers. That looks scary, right? Are you okay? This looks like a crime." Just to get recognition and understanding of the crime she's experiencing, it requires the victim to disclose and to really pay a cost, frankly. So we see how these behaviors can be really, really difficult, again, for outsiders to recognize and to understand. Sometimes I make a comparison when we talk about a physical assault, a punch, somebody has punched a person. It's relatively easy for other people to see that and say, oh, something bad has happened, right? That is probably an assault. When we talk about stalking behaviors, it's almost impossible for outsiders to say, oh, something bad is happening. I think that might be stalking. It's really, really difficult. So, our last category, this interference through sabotage or attack, is just kind of a fancy way of saying harm, right? The stalker threatens to cause harm, and then the stalker absolutely does cause harm. We know that stalkers are incredibly violent. And we'll get into some of those risk factors in a bit, but they are much, much more likely to cause harm to the victim, to the community at large, to use weapons. There are some really lethal and dangerous outcomes that result from stalking behaviors. So when we are asking about a course of conduct, remember we kind of started this conversation by saying, when a victim comes to us because of an incident, I need a place to stay, something happened to my car, whatever it might be, we want to be proactively asking about other stalking behaviors. But when we do that, we want to be really intentional about the way we ask it, right? We don't want to say, are you experiencing stalking behaviors? We don't really want to say, are you experiencing surveillance, right? I mean, we can, but we're just not going to get high quality answers when we ask it that way. I'll give a kind of a example, a correlation. I remember as a prosecutor learning about strangulation and the significance of strangulation within, forms of abuse. I was so kind of motivated by my training. I thought as soon as I got back to court, I'm going to screen everybody for strangulation. And I did. Every case I had the next day in court. Have you ever been strangled? Has he ever strangled you? Right? When I screened for strangulation like that, I had zero disclosures. Zero people said yes. And I thought, man, this is bizarre. This is something's not right here. We're not matching the data points. And what I learned was it was my language, right? And so what I learned was I had to ask about the behavior and not use a term. Strangle is a term. Behavior is kind of a universal explanation, right? So instead of saying, does he strangle you? What I said the very first time I changed my screening question, and I will forever remember this disclosure, I said, does he ever put his hands on your neck? I asked about the behavior, right? And I asked it in that way, and this victim said, oh, yeah, he held me up against the wall by my neck. I fell asleep for a little bit, but then he woke me back up, right? She had just disclosed to me she had been strangled to the point of unconsciousness. She was not using the word strangled. She doesn't have to use the word strangled. But I got the information I needed and I understood what was happening in her life. So when we talk about stalking behaviors, we don't want to use terms. We want to ask about the specific behavior we're curious about, right? Being really intentional in our questions. So our second bucket, our big picture element, and this is not really complicated, but it's this directed at a specific person. And we see it here in our statute, directed specifically at another person. This is a very common element in our stalking statutes. This isn't, that's not overly complicated, but what we want to understand is stalkers are regularly utilizing third parties to engage in their stalking behaviors. And so what I mean by that is one of the trends that we're seeing right now is stalkers utilizing kind of delivery services to engage in stalking behaviors. They might order dinner on a delivery service app, and then they text the driver on the app and they say, hey, you can actually keep that meal. I'm not hungry. And I'm going to tip you an extra 20 bucks. Will you just go by the address that I put in and see if there's a white truck in the driveway? Right? And the delivery driver's like, jackpot. Yeah, absolutely. Free dinner and 20 bucks. Absolutely. We want to understand that use of third parties that doesn't negate the course of conduct. We can understand, we can use critical thinking to see that the intent behind that behavior is still to target the individual, right? The stalker is utilizing third parties, but they are still directing their behavior at a specific individual. The stalker did not drive by the victim's house, right? But they put the kind of action in motion for that to happen to carry out their course of conduct. All right, our third bucket is we saw in the statute there that it would cause fear for safety, the victim's safety or safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. We see that here in the statute, right? That was kind of our second clause there. Fear of bodily injury, that an offense will be committed against a person's property, or to feel harassed. That's the impact that it's having on the victim. That's not overly complicated. But we want to think about how we identify this. One thing I love seeing in our legal statutes, which I know is a weird thing to say, but I love seeing in our legal statutes when we are very clear and explicit about what can be included under things like property, and particularly when it relates to pets or animals, right? We know that the abuse of pets, threatening pets, utilizing and weaponizing pets is a really common tool for abusers. So we want to understand, again, when we have this impact that we're looking for, I'm worried that an offense will happen against my property. It can be, I'm worried that they're going to hurt my dog. I'm worried they're going to hurt my cat, right? That can be considered that impact, and that qualifies as that element. So when we want to identify, has the victim been impacted? Has the victim felt fear? Has the victim felt harassed? has the victim suffered because of this course of conduct? We again just want to think really clearly about, or kind of critically about how we ask about impact. And I know that this is not shocking, but sometimes we overlook how hard it is for people to articulate that they feel fear. One time I was hearing from a family member who was calling me, as an older gentleman who I've known for a very long time, obviously. He was calling me to tell me about some stalking behaviors that he was experiencing from a neighbor. He was telling me the behaviors, they were really escalating. And I made the mistake of saying to him, "Oh my gosh, that sounds really scary," right? I thought I was kind of validating his experience. And what I quickly realized was I was making him uncomfortable, right? His response to that was, "I'm not scared. I'm just telling you, if they show up again, I'm going to shoot them," right? I thought in that moment, first of all, I recognized my mistake, but I also thought in that moment, what an easy mistake that could be. If I had been a advocate, case manager, law enforcement officer, I could have heard that response and I could have made a case note very clearly. Victim states that he is not afraid, because he did, right? But if I'm listening critically to what the victim said, he didn't want to say, "I'm scared." He really quickly reworded it for me, right? No, 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 I'm not scared. I'm just saying I'm thinking of the most extreme form of self-defense I can. I'm preparing myself to take lethal action against another human. That's how out of control this feels. That's how intense this feels. Is it is at the end of my spectrum for what I am able to do to protect myself, right? He was articulating his impact in a way that was comfortable for him. So we want to be really intentional about the way that we talk about impact. We might have victims say, "I feel afraid," right? But we might have a lot of victims who are uncomfortable articulating that. I talk to a lot of times to victims because of their profession, they don't feel like they can articulate the impact. It is not uncommon for me to hear from law enforcement officers who are experiencing extreme forms of stalking. And these officers will tell me, I want to report it or I want it to stop, but I can't like make a report because I can't put in a report that I'm afraid, right? That'll mess up my job. My coworkers will look at me differently. My boss, I'm worried my boss will think I can't do my job, right? So because of their professional standing, right, or expectations, it's hard. They feel a real struggle to articulate the impact. And it's this is not just law enforcement, right? That could be a lot of different reasons a victim might feel that way. So we want to think about all the ways we can ask about it. One of the things that we can do, we can talk about actual impact, right? How does it make you feel? We might have victims who are more comfortable talking about their fear for others. "I'm not scared about me. I'm just worried about my partner or my kids or my parents," right? "I'm worried about their safety or how it's impacting them." Sometimes people are more comfortable talking about that. Sometimes people are more comfortable talking about kind of the accommodations that they've made in their life. "Yeah, I'm not scared. I just, the example I gave, I'm not scared. I just bought a gun." No, I'm not scared. I don't take the city buses anymore and I quit working night shifts and I also dropped 3 classes this semester. "I'm not scared, but I'm not sleeping and I've lost 15 pounds because I can't eat," right? So we want to be listening critically and paying attention to all of the ways a victim might be articulating that impact. All right, our last bucket, and then we're almost done with legal statutes. Our last bucket is context. Okay, so our first kind of was that course of conduct. Our second in general is kind of the impact. How did it make the victim feel? And then our third bucket is context. And the reason why we want to consider context is because we have a reasonable person standard in our statute, as most statutes do. So it's not enough that it made the victim feel afraid. We also have an obligation to show the court a reasonable person would have also been afraid, right? Or harassed, annoyed, embarrassed. So when we talk about this reasonable person standard, sometimes that feels a little I don't know, kind of nebulous. What is that? Who is a reasonable person? What does that mean? What we really need to understand here is the reasonable person standard speaks to context. Here's what happens in stalking cases in general. I'll use that example that I gave earlier about the dozen white roses, right?
Go. Yeah.
We might document the rose delivery and we might share that as a part of the course of conduct. And then she got a dozen white roses, but we don't give context behind it. We don't do a very good job explaining the significance of the behaviors. So it's kind of akin to this, if anybody ever watched Family Feud, where they're kind of like polling 100 people. Here's the difference in context. No context is going out on the sidewalk and asking 100 people, would you be terrified of a delivery of a dozen white roses? Would that scare you? Is that something that makes you feel afraid, harassed, annoyed? 100 people are going to answer that question for the most part. No, that sounds great. I love getting flowers, right? Doesn't bother me. What we need to be doing when we are advocating for victims of stalking is giving context to the behaviors and asking the question like this. If you had been in an abusive relationship and the abuser had threatened your life, right, giving the entire story and then saying, would you be scared if you got a dozen white roses? Think about how those answers would change, right? We would have way more of our respondents saying, oh, yeah, that does sound comfortable. Yeah, that is not fun for me, right? I don't want those roses. So we want to think about making sure we are advocating that we are telling the entire story behind the behaviors in the course of conduct. And when we do that, we're able to meet that reasonable person standard. All right, so we had some questions. I'm going to try to review them quickly here. Threatening someone's career, if there's no threat of injury. Is property also cover the victim's business? Okay, so Denise, I'll dig into yours with a little bit of specificity if we have time at the end relative to kind of advocating for a response. But in general, let's talk about these questions about someone's career, right? Threatening someone's career. And we're going to kind of go back and look at the statute just a little bit. But our big buckets are the course of conduct. So we've got that behavior. I cannot imagine that threatening someone's profession would not be considered part of that course of conduct. But we want to make sure we can fill these other two buckets based on that behavior. So did the behavior, the threatening behavior, cause the victim to feel harassed, annoyed, alarmed, abused, tormented, embarrassed, or offended? I'm going to guess, and I'm making some assumptions, I'm going to guess probably yes, right? Though I understand those feelings, that impact can be harder to prove, right? That gets a little bit more difficult. When we're talking about impact that falls under those categories, annoyed, we want to do a really thorough job of showing exactly what we mean. In that, there's a difference in I'm stuck at this traffic light, I'm annoyed, versus this behavior, maybe they're tanking my Google reviews online, right? Maybe they're spreading bad rumors about my business. Maybe they're calling colleagues. This is ruining my day, my week, my month. I'm losing money over it. I'm losing clients over it, whatever the case might be. But we really want to do a very thorough job of documenting that impact to show that it does meet that second element, right? And then that third bucket that we just talked about, sorry, make everybody car sick going through these slides, but is the reasonable person standard. So we need to, again, make sure we're telling the whole story to say, person on the street, if you had a business, right, or whatever it might be, and someone was calling your clients and saying these things, or putting these things on the internet, or whatever it is, we want to make sure we're telling the whole story so that the random person on the street can hear it and say, oh, that does sound bad. That's not good, right? That sounds harassing. That sounds annoying or alarming. So, I can't say definitively, absolutely, that will qualify as stalking, but it really speaks to the importance, the significance of really thoroughly telling that story. And I want to point out when we talk about those impacts, feeling annoyed or harassed, Here, don't get distracted by those questions. When we talk about, how do we show that somebody is annoyed? We'll do a quick little exercise here. If you had to prove to me, you had to prove to me beyond a reasonable doubt that you are hungry before I will end this seminar and let you take a break for lunch, how would you prove to me that you were hungry? Thoughts? Ideas? Record my stomach growling. Okay, belly. So you're talking about some physical presentations, right? And if I was kind of unreceptive, I might hear that and say, sounds like you just need to see a doctor. I don't really think that has anything to do with hunger, right? Chewing paper. Okay. Maybe some extreme, behaviors. Yeah. I might just tell you that I'm hungry. I might tell you why I'm hungry. I've had participants say, like, I'll show you that how many calories I've burned today and how many calories I've taken in, right? I might try to show you mathematically that I'm hungry. And the reason I do this silly exercise is just kind of to show when you're talking about an emotion, it gets really difficult to prove. Frankly, particularly if you have an audience that's not receptive, right? Nice, Michael. Yeah, you might have an audience who's just like, I don't believe you. I don't really think you're that hungry, right? My children would tell you that, tell them that all the time, right? You're fine. You can make it. You're not that hungry. But you guys are already doing the work of all of the ways that you can show an emotion. I can tell you, I can document my physical presentations, right? My stomach's growling, I'm weak, my blood pressure's dropping, my blood sugar's dropping. I can talk to you about the accommodations I'm making in my life. I'm getting up and leaving. I'm zoning out, right? I'm not paying attention anymore. All of those are part of the package to help me better understand, oh, you are actually hungry, right? We want to think about that when we are talking about proving an emotion like annoyance, harassment, all these types of emotional distress. Gather all the pieces of the puzzle together. Don't assume that your victim saying, I'm annoyed, is going to be enough because they might hit someone, law enforcement, a judge, a prosecutor who says, nah, I'm not buying it, right? I don't really think you are. We want to have as much documentation as we can. It might be witnesses, it might be medical providers, it might be mental health providers, it might be coworkers, right? As much as we can to show this is impacting the victim's life. So something to keep in mind as we are talking about advocating for victims of stalking particularly. All right, so we've got a little quiz here. I'm going to move past that because we kind of have expanded a little bit on this section. I want to make sure we have time to get through our content. This will be in the slides. You guys are going to get a copy of them. The short answer, or kind of the cheat sheet behind these questions is, it's really an exercise for you to think about scenarios and to walk through those buckets, right? Is there a course of conduct, more than one event? Is it directed at a specific person? Does it cause harm? And are we going to meet that reasonable person standard? And you really need to have that analysis every time you are working to identify stalking behaviors and thinking, really what I would encourage you to do, if you hit one of those buckets, right, one of those elements, and you're like, I don't know if this causes harm, if this harm rises to the level of a stalking element. What we want to do as responders, instead of just saying, nope, not stalking, is whatever we're stuck on, we want to make sure we're finding out more information, right? That's a chance for us to say, let me learn more. Let me dig into this just a little bit to see if there's any more information here. All right, so when we talk about the trauma relative to stalking, you've already heard me kind of expand on this, and we know and we understand the very significant impact that it has in victims' lives. One of the things I just want to point out is the level of hypervigilance that a victim of stalking has to maintain. I use this as an example, and I don't mean to use this example to diminish a stalking victim's experience, but maybe something that we can all relate to. If we think about a scary movie, right? If anybody here enjoys a good scary movie, I certainly did when I was a kid. Not so much anymore. But when I was a kid, I remember watching the movie Scream. So I'll just kind of inherently date myself a little bit there. If anybody else has seen it, maybe you can relate to it. If you haven't seen it, spoiler alert coming up, but you're also 30 years behind, so don't feel too bad. But when we think about that movie, and I think about when I watched it, that movie's really violent. It's really gory. There's some pretty horrific scenes in it. But the scene that stuck with me, the scene that still gives me goosebumps to think about, really had nothing to do with the gore or the blood or the murders. It was all about the phone call, right? When she gets the phone call and you find out the phone call is coming from inside the house. And the reason that that burned into my brain when I watched it was because the audience is in this moment of, I don't know what's going to happen next, right? The unknown is an extreme level of fear. And there is an anticipation for what might happen, right? That's a lot of energy. So when we think about victims of stalking, and we're talking about violence occurring to them or their loved ones, right? Harm happening to them, we can start to appreciate and understand this high level of vigilance, of energy that it takes, that it kind of like sucks out of their life, right? They are constantly waiting for what's going to happen next. And when we talk about that vigilance, we're not talking about it happening once, twice, a week. We oftentimes are talking about it happening for months, if not years. These victims are sitting in that moment of vigilance for extended periods of time. We can start to imagine how that impacts physically the brain, anatomically, right? But we also can think about the toll that takes on mental health, physical health, relationships, professions, right? It has a huge impact on that victim's life. And to that end, when we talk about stalking behaviors, we want to be really kind of cognizant of what I kind of call the echo effect of stalking behaviors. It's not just the stalking behavior itself, it's how it impacts that victim's life, on and on and on. So when we talk about the echo effect, I'm going to use an example that is extreme, but it's also very, very common. We might have a victim who gets a text message from the stalker, and it's a video of their pet being tortured, right? They're weaponizing that pet. And obviously, that's difficult for the victim to recover from. That's incredibly traumatic. It's going to impact their day, if not their week, if not their month. We can talk about that video in and of itself, but what we don't talk about a lot of times is how it impacts the victim every single time they get a text message from then on out, right? What's going to happen to their body every time they get a text message? And it might be a text message from their mom, but their body is going to react and prepare them to receive something really, really horrific. I kind of equate it, if anybody here has ever been on call for, particularly for like a victim service agency or something similar, you have had that experience of, being woken up in the middle of the night and triaging something incredibly traumatic. I was on call many, many years ago. I'm not on call now. I'm in no danger of being on call, but I can tell you what happens to my body if I'm walking through the airport and somebody has that ring on their phone, right? If I hear that on-call ring, my body reacts. It has a physical reaction, right? So we think about that echo effect throughout the victim's life. Every form of abuse that stalker engages in creates an echo in that area of the victim's life. So if the stalker shows up at work, now work has an echo effect. If the stalker shows up at church, now church has an echo effect. If the stalker uses text messages have an echo effect, right? And you guys are describing that physical reaction, right? You can relate to it. So we imagine victims having that in multiple areas of their life, right? And you cannot logic your way out of it. You can't tell your brain to turn it off. It happens whether you like it or not. And we know how draining it is. Phoebe says you feel it in your stomach, right? It can be nauseating. It can take you out of a conversation, right? It can disrupt whatever it is you're doing. It's really, really impactful. So this is the level of trauma that victims are experiencing when they're experiencing stalking behaviors. And because of that, they are coping in a lot of different ways. Patricia, you're hitting on that, not being able to sleep well. We'll talk about that in just a bit, right? Those physical presentations, certainly. But sometimes even their behavior, they're coping with it in the best way that they can. And really, what we want to make sure we are aware of as outsiders, that we're never in a place of judgment, right? That we're never looking at a victim's behavior and saying, well, that doesn't make sense to me. I'll give a quick example. If we had a victim of stalking, let's say, if I come into court for a hearing and the defense attorney is looking very proud and says, good luck today. She called him last night, right? They talked for 2 hours. She's laughing and joking and having a great time. He recorded the whole conversation. So good luck. Good luck showing that she's afraid of him. It could be really easy for me in that moment to feel really discouraged, right? If I'm being honest, I might even feel a little bit angry or frustrated. Gosh, has this victim been lying to me? Have they been wasting my time, right? But if I stayed curious in that moment and I had a connection, I had built trust with that victim, what I might find out from that victim is she might tell me, yeah, I did call him last night. I called him at home, right? Now, sometimes I have to tell audience members, I can't see y'all, so I can't make judgments. Sometimes I have to tell folks that phones used to be plugged into the wall, right? I know that's a hard concept to understand, but that's what she's describing. I called him at home. I called him on his landline because when I call him on his landline, I know where he is. He's at home, right? And I was worried about this hearing today, and I needed 2 hours of guaranteed peace that he was not going to show up and terrorize us. I needed to feed my kids and bathe my kids and get them into bed so I could just be ready for today, right? And the best way to keep him on the phone is to feed that narcissism, treat him like he's the most charming, hilarious person I've ever met. I know how to play that game. That's not a victim who's not afraid. That's not a victim who's gaming the system. That is a victim who is taking extreme measures to manage their own mental safety, emotional safety, and physical safety, right? So if we are engaging with victims and they are behaving in a way that doesn't make sense to us, somebody gave the example earlier, being hungry, that I might start eating paper, right? Like I might look at that and say, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think you're actually hungry, right? We want to make sure that if they are engaging in behaviors that don't make sense to us, that we stay curious. We get curious about what's motivating that behavior so that we can really understand how that victim's being impacted. This quote from a survivor says, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I've given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I'll be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And we hear from victims, we hear from survivors who say, you know, it was equivalent to feeling like I'm being hunted in plain sight. The unfortunate reality behind that feeling is they're oftentimes not that wrong. That these are cases that have incredibly lethal outcomes. And I want to point out some of these indicators when we talk about stalking behaviors, because I know we've got folks from all different areas of our system, right? Advocates, maybe folks who work in the civil legal system, the criminal legal system, folks who work in the community at large. If we have folks who are here from pretrial supervision or probation, corrections, we understand when we look at these risk factors, this is important for all of us, right? We all, in the work that we do at large, are kind of screening for cases that might have these indicators, right? We're looking for cases that might result in harm, looking for cases that might result in harm to the community at large, looking for cases that might have a likelihood to use weapons. We're looking for cases that are escalating quickly. We're looking for offenders who have a high likelihood to reoffend. We are wanting to pay attention to these types of cases. So we know that stalking behaviors can be a big clue for us, a really clear indicator that these are the cases we want to be paying attention to. Unfortunately, though, we see that the response or the perception of risk can be a little bit overlooked when we talk about ways that we're analyzing these behaviors and certainly the ways that we're responding to it. When we are talking about recognizing risk, analyzing risk, I'm going to give us some tools here on ways that we can do that. But I really want us to make sure we are grounded in the victim's perception, right? They are the expert in their own experience. If they are telling us, I think this person is going to kill me, there is no tool, there is no resource, there is no training out there that supersedes that opinion. If the victim's telling you that, that's what we're going with, and that's what we're paying attention to, right? So we want to make sure that we're never overlooking that victim's expertise in their own experience when we talk about screening for safety and screening for risk. Now, when we talk about stalking cases, the risk factors we want to be looking for, we're going to break down these categories in just a bit, talking about ways we can uncover this information. But this is, in general, kind of our 14 points that we want to be considering, that we want to really be paying attention to when we talk about stalking experiences and particularly abusive behaviors. Now, the real gift here is when we talk about risk assessment, when we talk about, incorporating this new knowledge, that's a lot. And I fully recognize it's a lot. There is a wonderful, free, accessible tool that you all can use to immediately start incorporating this information. Has anyone here ever used the stalking and harassment assessment and risk profile? You can just pop in the chat if you have. I'm just curious. We see a lot of our professionals in the field utilizing this. This is a risk profile. It lives online. Great. Yes, I'm seeing some yeses. That's awesome. It lives online. It's developed by the researcher who actually identified these risk factors. It is confidential. It is evidence-based. It is very thorough. It can be a really, really helpful resource for us in a lot of different ways. Great, Michael. Thank you for that feedback too. Yeah, I think so too. This is not my product, so I'm not selling it. I just think it's really helpful. I wish I had known about it when I was in the field. But what this risk profile does is walk through those risk factors. It can really help structure a conversation with a victim of stalking and help us identify what's really going on here. Now, I'll just say, and those of you who have used it, you can give your feedback as well. I will tell you from being in the field, I was used to risk assessments or screening tools as being like fast, right? 10 questions, kind of triage type tools. This is not a triage tool. This is something that will take a while, right? 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, depending on how the conversation goes. It's thorough, and it also creates some really helpful products. What it does is develop a risk profile. It also helps put together a narrative of that victim's experience. And that's all based on what the individual puts into it, right? It's not making things up. It's not guessing at what's occurring. It's all based on what information is put into it. Now, a couple of ways that this can be really helpful. First and foremost, we see this being utilized sometimes just by victims and advocates to help a victim prepare themselves for things like an order of protection, or to prepare themselves for things like going to talk to law enforcement. If you've been doing this work long, I can imagine you have worked with victims of stalking. When they come to you, they have already been managing their experience for a long time. And so when we ask them, like, okay, tell me what's going on, it's like, oh my gosh, where do I start, right? And it's a lot of information. And because of trauma, it might jump all over the place. And it can be hard as a listener to really kind of follow the thread. This is a really helpful way to kind of organize that victim's experience and help make it easy for someone else to clearly see what's going on in their life. So that can be really, really helpful. We have heard from some civil attorneys in jurisdictions across the country who have actually utilized it in order of protection hearings. They've used it in a petition for a protective order. They've used it in the hearing for a protective order. We have heard some prosecutors in other jurisdictions across the country who have utilized this in bond hearings, right? You will see kind of down in the last sentence of that paragraph that I have expanded there, there's a really kind of simple analysis that this report does and it really just compares the data to the risk factors. And it will say X number of risk factors are present. That can be a really helpful and easy thing for a judicial official to digest, right? Whoa, 13 of 14 risk factors are present. Okay, I'm paying attention now, right? So it can be really, really helpful. I've talked to law enforcement who use it in their investigations. It really helps them build a robust report about the stalking behavior, and it makes sure that they're asking all of the questions, all of the relevant questions, right? So I would really recommend it. You can go check it out. It's online at coercivecontrol.org. You can also get to it from our site. I will just tell you, when you go to check it out, you can actually walk through it. But I think maybe like the fifth or sixth question down, it's going to ask you, are you doing a real case or are you testing this out, right? Please make sure that you select, I'm just test driving. I'm just testing it. We don't want to corrupt the data, but we want to make sure that you guys feel comfortable using it. I would check it out before, you work with a victim and you start to use it. Okay. It's about almost 10:30 your time. So we're about halfway through. I think I'm going to take a little pause here. I know we've got some questions. We have a lot of content to get through. This is what I'm going to do unless I hear otherwise. It is 10:25. We're going to come back and start content again at 10:35. That will be the break. I'm going to sit tight here and answer what questions we might have, and I'll do that audibly in real time. So if anybody else wants to listen, you're welcome to. And Crystal, I don't know if there was any housekeeping that folks needed to do at this point, maybe a survey. Oh, you're still on mute.
I'm gonna save the world on mute someday. All right. So fantastic, fantastic place to start for part one. If you haven't, the link for the training evaluation. If you are coming back for part two and you plan to complete today's session, you only need to do this once. But if you're not coming back after the break, if you don't mind filling it out before you go, if you will put Crystal Garcia as TOS's primary staff member on that and stalking as our topic for today. The survey is going to ask you for those two things and the date of today's session. And that's all we have. We did have some questions in the chat box related to housekeeping. We are distributing a copy of today's slides with the follow-up email that gives you access to the CEU/proof of participation document that we will be distributing. So be on the lookout for those two resources in your email. You'll have a great break. Let's see, I saw one more. Yes, you will be getting slides for the whole training. Everybody who is registered to attend today that completes the session will be getting that follow-up email. So, yeah. So, all right. And then, yes, we will repost the link for the training survey in just a second. So, y'all guys have a great break.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to answer these questions. If Sarah and Denise, it looks like maybe Adriana and Hannah, if you're still on, I'll answer these questions. And then hopefully you're still here. If you're here to hear it, and if not, maybe you can go back. Okay. So Sarah, you're talking about that threatening career, even though there's no threat of injury. I think we kind of addressed that, right? With that impact, that annoyance or that harassment. It looks like client having an issue. She's not seen him anywhere, but he continually drops off presents at her home in the middle of the night. Does that count as well for the course of conduct? That is absolutely life invasion behaviors. I think what we want to do when we talk about, and I'm going to skip over Denise's for just a second because I think Sarah's is kind of an addendum to that last one. And it sounds like the client's not getting a response, right? Maybe not getting a response from law enforcement, a little bit concerned, as you should be, when we talk about safety planning. If we are putting some type of, having some type of response to the stalking behavior, analyzing, is this going to escalate, right? Is this going to cause actual threat to the victim? So I think that's a wise thing to be considering. But what I would really encourage you and your client to do, well, first and foremost, I'm sorry that they're having this experience. I know that that's frustrating and I know that it is exhausting, right? What I would really encourage you to do though, and maybe you have already done some of these things, is trying to shore up that. When I say storytelling, that sounds like I'm telling a fib. Maybe that's because I'm from the South, but I mean storytelling in that, like telling the entire narrative as much as possible. So when we talk about dropping off these presents, if we have a Ring camera, video footage of it, if we don't have a Ring camera, one thing we recommend a lot of times when we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of collecting some evidence of these kind of life invasion behaviors are things like trail cameras. Cameras can be a little bit more discreet. They can be a little bit more comprehensive. They can be triggered by motion a little bit more effectively. But sometimes when we hear about, dropping off presents, that is creepy in the middle of the night. But it also, if I'm trying to elicit a response from someone, them seeing the pictures or videos of someone doing that, it can be a little bit more impactful. Oh, that is weird, right? Oh, it is pitch black outside. Oh, this is strange, right? It tells a more robust story. So things that we can do like that can be really, really helpful. And then the other part of it, when we are trying to get a response from whatever system it might be, it kind of goes back to being fluent in those statutes. What I oftentimes find is it helps facilitate communication and it helps facilitate kind of partnership. Is if I come to whatever system I'm wanting to get a response from, and I say, hey, this is how I'm understanding the statute, right? I understand I need these 3 buckets or these 4 buckets that we talked about today. And here are the things I have to fill those 4 buckets. Here are all the things that are in the course of conduct, right? Here are all the ways that this has impacted the victim, and on and on. So showing that, just kind of laying it out in some of those kind of simplistic terms, but then leaving an opportunity to say, well, what am I missing? Right? You're telling me that it's not stalking, and I'm not understanding why it's not stalking. I'm not understanding why there can't be a response. Sometimes that can legitimately be helpful, right? Maybe there's something on our end we're misunderstanding. Sometimes it can be helpful to the responder to help them understand the statute, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, that actually, I see what you're saying here. So we just want to think about ways that we can structure that conversation. And like I said, just not being or feeling empowered to go and have those conversations and really breaking down whatever system it is that we're wanting to utilize, breaking that down and asking specific questions. What are we missing? What more do you need? Sometimes that could be a helpful way to structure that conversation. And that's not going to be a cure-all, no doubt. And, the unfortunate thing is that experience is not incredibly uncommon, but in the same way that, maybe some of you had never had training on just stalking before, it's not uncommon for other partners in the system to never have had stalking training before. So you might be talking to a deputy or an officer or a magistrate who's never had stalking training before. So you can kind of use it as an opportunity very kindly to provide some of that training, some of that information. But a lot of documentation, a lot of telling the entire narrative that can really, really help for that. To that end, and Sarah, you can pop in the chat if there's more you need on that or want to talk about that. Let's see. Denise, I skipped over yours. Is property also cover the victim's business? If so, what can I advise the victim to do after reporting and nothing being done due to no probable cause? I think kind of similar, Denise, like the things that we were just talking about, right? Taking those statutes, we have a real breakdown in our communication with other people in the system when we are getting answers that are just very general, right? And I'm saying like that is just what you're dealing with, but let's drill down into that. No probable cause for which element? Which part of the statute are we missing here? Which part do we not have enough
Um,
information for?
yes, so that's what caught my attention because everything that you've been explaining, it's all there.
Mm-hmm.
And mind you, I'm sure from your experience, you're very well aware how hard it is to just even obtain a protective order for a
Sure.
victim, right? Sometimes there's no proof and they approve them. Here you
Yep.
go. Sometimes there's so much and yeah, no. And so we never know the outcome. So when we do get a protective order for stalking, it's for me, it's like, wow, shocking because those are so hard. It's hard for
Mm-hmm.
some reason, it's hard to prove. Look. he's stalking or she's
This is a
stalking him.
thing. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, so then
right.
this individual in particular already does have a protective order in place. He did come in and he did, I spoke with him as far as he's like, look, it's because there's a protective order now in place.
Hmm.
But now what he's doing, because the protective order states that he can contact me directly, he's going on my business page and
Hmm.
he's writing all these negative comments about me and about my business. So I feel that's harassing, and he shouldn't be harassing me
Hmm.
directly or indirectly, right?
Sure.
And I go, yes, of course, absolutely. So to there at that point, I'm already, okay, so getting all these facts just to try and get a law enforcement, to,
Hmm.
hey, look, understand. And so it took all that and no speaking to supervisors. It's because it's not our opinion at this point. You're making it your opinion. I don't think so. It's not
Hmm.
about you. It's about the victim. If the victim feels harassed, then just do the report and allow for a judge or detective, right, to
Make that
determine if there
decision. Yeah.
is any type of violation. Finally, we were able to they do the report. The officers go ahead and they present it to a judge so they can possibly get a warrant out for the arrest because of the violation of protective order. And the
Hmm.
judge decided to say that there was no probable cause because it was not
I
direct
gotcha.
to him, that it was
Gotcha.
to his business. So
Gotcha.
now he's like, I don't know what to do, and
Yeah.
I'm also like, I don't know what to do. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. That's legit.
what?
Yeah.
So
Oh.
I'm so confused. So what I'm hoping is that you can provide me some guidance as far as like what I can tell him, like, or
Hmm.
advise him. Okay, like the report is there, even though nothing's gonna happen anymore, no probable cause, but it's there. It's
Yep.
documented. Now from here on, just like I have an idea, but I guess it kind of makes you doubt yourself at times.
Sure.
Just
Sure.
kind of getting some reassurance as far as to like what I can advise him. Like
Sure.
these are the next steps we can take and keep track and whatnot and
Yeah.
then go try it again. But it's insane. Like everything that you're talking about, it was like, what?
Yeah.
When you're
Right.
talking about it and everything that he shared with me, we
Yeah.
added it
You're
on
like, we're
there
checking all the
and
boxes here. Yeah. Yeah. No, I
yes,
hear you. And
yes.
yes, I hear that frustration. And it's not much comfort to know that is a really common experience, unfortunately, which I'm so sorry for. But you are doing the right things. And if I can just take a moment to put some gas in your tank, that responding to these crimes in particular does take a high level of resilience and frankly tenacity. And that's not fair. It shouldn't, but it does. And I think what you're doing can continue to help promote this individual's safety and hopefully elicit a response. But that documentation, right? Um, and utilizing maybe both sides of the legal system, both the civil legal system within the protective order and the criminal legal system. I think I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to highlight here in just a bit, and I think, Hannah, it will also answer your question. We have a documentation log that can be helpful, that can really kind of give some guidance on what needs to be recorded and how to record all the things that are happening, which we recognize is taxing for victims. But I would also encourage you, if you haven't already, maybe having that victim do the SHARP. Having that assessment can be helpful. Particularly, it sounds like some of the things that you're experiencing are responders saying, "This doesn't really rise to the level. This doesn't feel that scary, or this isn't really a threat." Sometimes having that sharp
Mm-hmm.
can be a good bolster to say, like, no, this person, the way that they're engaging and the way that they're behaving is actually an indicator of physical risk. And that can be
Mm-hmm.
helpful sometimes to elicit that response. None of these things are going to be home runs, unfortunately. I don't have like, this is absolutely how you solve the problem. But what we see is advocates and victims and responders who are willing to just keep taking bites of the apple from different ways, right? Just keep getting creative and stick with it. keep coming back. Don't
Mhm.
let one judge's decision, one response from a system discourage, even though I know it does feel discouraging. You're not crazy. You're not, you're not chasing a loose end here. This is something that requires, unfortunately, like I said, just a lot of diligence, a lot of resilience, but you're doing the right thing. And I think like continuing to help build that narrative to show the whole picture, hopefully will start to have that impact that it should be having. But again, it's not I wish I could like wave a wand and fix that situation for you because I know that that's incredibly, incredibly
Yeah.
difficult.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you so much. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that sharp. I'm surprised I had never heard of that assessment. I'm definitely gonna have him do that, and it's sad that I've had to come to the extreme of saying things, like if something happens to, the victim tonight. I don't want this falling on me. Would you like for
Yeah.
it to fall on you? For
Sure.
them
Sure.
to,
Yeah.
all right, like actually think about it. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess. And it's like, okay, well, at least you're doing it for the wrong reason, but okay, you
Yeah,
did
yeah, so true. Yeah.
it.
It's something. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I hear you.
Yeah.
You're doing an excellent job advocating. And I think
Thank you.
knowing that and trusting that and kind of keeping the faith in that approach can be really helpful. I do want to, let's see, I want to try to get to some of these questions before we jump back into content. Adriana, you were asking about that higher prevalence of women experiencing stalking. Um, that's a great question on why, and I think why that's true could be a whole day's training. There is absolutely stalking. Victims can be of both genders. Absolutely, men and women can experience stalking, but we do know that women experience it at a higher rate. The why is $1 million question. I wish I had the answer to, because then maybe we could solve it. But I don't, and that doesn't feel great for me to be able to offer you. But I also don't want to pontificate on something I'm not qualified to really answer. Cornelia is asking about those spreading rumors, posting stuff, that kind of written communication. When does that go from protected speech under the First Amendment to part of the course of conduct, right? That's a really great question. There was a Supreme Court case that came out in 2023 called Counterman that speaks specifically to that. What we oftentimes see when we talk about written speech, we know that true threats, if you are making a true threat, it is not protected speech. The First Amendment is not a totally all-inclusive protection. It does not protect an individual against true threats. Now, what the heck is a true threat? You can read that case if you want to. We actually have a whole training on that really kind of digs into that Supreme Court ruling and talks about how you can analyze and take a look at the conversation, the language. Context plays a big part in that when we're analyzing what is protected speech and what is not protected speech. But all of that lives on our site if you want to go. And like I said, that is its own training in and of itself, but it's a great question and one that comes up. One of the things that is significant when we are talking about those rumors, written threats, written behavior, when our course of conduct is relative to speech, we want to make sure and look at, are there other parts of the course of conduct that are in person, right? They're making threats online and they're showing up at work and they're sending gifts, whatever the case might be. When we have that in-person behavior in conjunction with written behavior, right? Speech elements, we start to see that speech elements, the First Amendment protection starts to disintegrate a little bit when it kind of speaks more to the intent behind that language, and it becomes there's a higher likelihood that that language is less protected, if that makes sense. That gets a little bit complicated and gets, somewhat intense from some Supreme Court ruling. But you can look that up, Counterman, and like I said, we've got trainings on that on our site. And I'm going to give my contact information at the end of this. If you want to reach out to me, we can also have a conversation about it. Because as you can see, I like talking all things stalking. Our last questions is what agencies help with the trail camera. Sorry, I maybe was a little bit confusing with that. I think my answer, I said we've talked with agencies before who have utilized trail cameras. I'm just talking about like literally buying a trail camera at your local outdoor store, right? Like just utilizing the cameras that are used for gathering wildlife, pictures of wildlife. The reason why we talk about trail cameras differently than things like security cameras is sometimes they're less expensive. They're less intense, right? You don't need a subscription. You don't have to do like a whole, system, and they can be a little bit more robust, and they can be a little bit more effective in capturing movement. So that's one of the reasons that we see agencies use those and find them to be a little bit more effective when we're trying to document an offender who's engaging in some behavior that's pretty sneaky, right? A little bit hard to recognize or to see. So that's what we meant when we were talking about trail cameras. Great questions, y'all. Great conversation. Let's dive back into our content, but keep the questions rolling, and we'll keep answering them as we go. And if for some reason, because we're having great conversation, we're not able to spend a ton of time on all the slides, as we've said a couple times, you guys are going to get the slides, and you can always reach out to me if you have any questions about any of these things. If you want to dig into any of these things, we're happy to talk more about that. So let's talk. We're going to move through these tips for identifying risk. And really what we want to emphasize here are kind of these categories of behaviors. Big picture, what's really going on here. We want to talk about the stalker's mindset, the way the stalker is excusing their behavior or explaining their behavior. We want to look at the history of the stalker individually, or the history of the relationship. We also want to consider the victim's circumstances, right? Are there specific vulnerabilities that are contributing to risk to the victim? And really, when we kind of break down these questions, this is not overly complicated. In fact, if we had more time, I would love to learn from y'all, the experts on the call today. Folks who have been doing this work long, you know that structuring conversations with victims is a little bit of an art, right? It takes some finesse. We really want to foster trust. We want to collect high quality information. So we want to be really kind of cognizant of that when we are asking about these risk factors. It kind of goes back to our point earlier of like, we can't just say, tell me the big picture, right? Like, we're not going to get a good amount of information, but we can ask about all of these things in creative ways and in really intentional ways. I will fully own the examples that I have up here on the screen are a little bit intense, right? I would argue, and like I said, you experts on the call would know even more about how to do this. Really effective ways to start these conversations is probably to start them a little bit softer, right? Tell me what's going on. What brought you here today? What can I help you with? You know, I heard an advocate one time recommend when we were talking about big picture, she structured her conversations. She started every conversation with, what do you want me to know? And I thought, what a great way, right? What a great way to give that individual some agency and to really let them kind of guide the narrative here. With that stalker's history, we want to be thinking about things like mental health issues, substance abuse issues. We want to think about prior violent or abusive relationships. We want to think about their behavior within the relationship, right? If the victim has known them, if they have been in a relationship with them, indicators or threats the stalker has made to engage in self-harm is a risk factor that we want to be paying attention to. Their access, their familiarity with firearms, with weapons is certainly something we want to be paying attention to. So we know with firearms in particular, we see a much higher likelihood that when a victim has a stalker who owns a firearm, there's an increased likelihood that they're going to be threatened with that firearm, right? That the victim is going to experience threat. One resource that we saw from some of our partners in Pitt County here in North Carolina, they developed this resource to help structure the conversation. Here in the South, you Texans might be able to relate. The majority of our cases, our offenders are going to be firearm owners, right? That's not going to be an uncommon thing. But we want to make it easier for our victims to really clearly articulate what type of firearms the offender might own, because we also know the type of firearm or the number of firearms can tell us different things, right? They could be indicators of different things when we are trying to assess risk, when we're trying to understand what that victim is facing. This resource is really helpful for Pitt County too. Here in North Carolina, if you are subject to certain court orders, you lose your right to have firearms. And so if law enforcement is going to relinquish someone of their firearms, to know how many are in the home and where they are in the home can be really, really helpful for law enforcement before they roll up, right? Helps them to assess their own risk, but also to make sure that they're doing a thorough job in collecting all of that. So stalker mindset, we just really want to get an idea, an understanding of, and this sometimes sounds maybe like kind of victim blaming. We're not trying to say, what have you done to make the stalker mad? But when we know statistically, if the stalker is justifying their behavior because they say things like, this person is mine, I'm entitled to them, or they've scorned me, they rejected me, and I'm getting my revenge. When we have indicators of that type of stalker mindset, we know that those stalkers pose a higher risk to their victims and to the community at large. If we have specific vulnerabilities that the victim's facing, we know those are indicators of higher risk, right? We see victims sometimes who say, I don't feel safe at home now. They know where my home is, so I'm hopping from hotel to hotel. Well, now their physical safety, right? There's a higher risk, a higher vulnerability for their physical safety because staying in random hotels is oftentimes less safe than being able to secure yourself in a residence. So we want to think about how the victim is managing their safety and what particular vulnerabilities they might be facing. When we talk about responding to victims and safety planning, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. With safety planning, I kind of feel I feel strongly about safety planning because it is so important. And my feelings about it sound contradictory, but I don't think they are. Here's what I think. I think everybody should be safety planning with victims, right? I don't care what your role is. I don't care if it's professional or personal. We should be asking victims, do you feel safe, right? Are you okay? We want to be triaging victim safety. But actual robust safety planning really should be done by a professional who has been trained in it. So what I mean by that, if for a while I worked as a civil attorney in the civil world. As a civil attorney, every time I met with a client, I should have been doing baseline level safety planning, right? Every time they were in my office, I should be asking them, hey, you feel safe? You good? How are things going? What's happening, right? I should be asking some basic questions. But I shouldn't be saying, hey, me as a civil attorney, I am doing your safety plan, right? I wasn't qualified to do that. I should say, I'm going to ask some basic questions, and I'm also going to plug you into professionals who can do this with real intentionality. I work with this victim service agency, right? I know this advocate. Let me make sure you get a robust safety plan. Does that make sense? I know it sounds contradictory, but we want to make sure that we're providing really effective safety planning for victims, and that we're also having safety plans that are constantly evolving, right? That we're thinking through all the things that are changing. This is the documentation log I mentioned earlier during the break. This lives on our site. You can download it. We have it in English and Spanish. If you need it in another language, let us know and we'll get it translated for you. But this can be helpful to give some guidance to victims when they are being told, hey, document everything. Give some structure to what should be documented. And it can make it a little bit easier for other entities, if it's law enforcement, a judge, whatever, to kind of quickly review and see that course of conduct and see it a little bit more efficiently and maybe a little bit more effectively. You know, when we talk about safety planning in general, we ultimately talk about advising disengagement. And what we mean by advising disengagement is we want to promote some insulation for that victim. We don't want to just tell that victim, well, you're just going to have to deal with it, right? We do want to be careful, though, and I've already forgotten the lovely person who mentioned it in their question, I think, but, you know, understanding that disengagement could actually be a threat to a victim that could actually escalate behavior. And we also understand that there is no easy answer to stalking. There is no just get off the internet or just block their number. And we know that if we've done work in this field long. I cannot think of a single case where the abuser said, oh man, they blocked my number. I guess I'll just stop, right? We know that abusers say, they blocked my number. I wonder how they're going to like it when I show up at work, right? We know that abusers are persistent, and when they feel like they're losing control, it oftentimes is an indicator of heightened risk. So we just want to be kind of careful as we are offering kind of guidance or suggestions on promoting insulation. Are there ways that the victim can feel safer or feel insulated from the stalker's behavior, but not just overstepping and saying, hey, here's a quick solution, here's an easy solution, just do X, Y, and Z. So as I mentioned, safety planning in general is a response to help improve and promote a victim's safety. It's something that should be flexible. It should be constantly evolving. It should be something that we revisit. You know, I said as a civil attorney, I should be asking my victim about their safety every time I see them. We should be revisiting this regularly. This is not a one and done thing. This is not a yearly thing. It is something we are regularly talking about. And these are just some general questions. If we are not professionally trained to safety plan, these are some general questions that we can be asking to do that triage, right? To do that kind of informal safety planning. Hey, what's working for you? What's not working for you? What do you need my help with? What can I help you do? What are ways that I could help support you or promote your safety? I've got some slides here. I'm going to move through these relatively quickly. You guys will get these and you can review them on your own. But just thinking through all of the areas of a victim's life, safety planning is not just about locks on a home, right? We're thinking about workplace, we're thinking about school, we're thinking about vacation, we're thinking about kids' school, we're thinking about all of the places, all of the areas that the victim will be living in or be in, and certainly thinking about technology as well. Ultimately, we want to make sure when we're safety planning, we're always balancing that safety and freedom. And what I mean by that is sometimes we have folks who are well-intentioned and their safety plan is to just kind of lock down the victim, right? Don't go out at night. Don't use the internet. Uh, don't date. Don't do these things, and it won't expose you to the potential of harm, right? Again, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's well-intentioned. But if we come in with a mentality of taking away from the victim, do less things, victims, you have less options in your life, we're doing things that are pretty unjust, right? That's a really unjust response because essentially we're telling that victim, hey, you should have a smaller life. You should have a smaller world because someone else is being abusive, right? And it's also not realistic. I don't think any of us would want to hear from an outsider randomly this afternoon, hey, you know those things that you've been doing, you can't do them anymore, right? You have less options. Nobody likes having their freedoms or their options reduced. So we want to be really careful about that. Now we can help a victim make informed decision. If they're walking their dog at 3 a.m, we might say, all right, tell me why. Like, why are you picking 3? Okay, here are the things I'm worried about. Are you worried about that, right? And you might bring up things and the victim says, oh gosh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. Or the victim might say, yeah, no, I've thought about that, but it's worth it to me. This is something I want to do, right? So we want to help them make informed decisions as much as possible to help promote that safety. So thinking through our response to victims of stalking, we think about these policies and procedures. We want to think about the ways that we're working with the public at large. Do we have policies in place? Do we have procedures in place that kind of empower us to recognize victims of stalking? And, maybe our screenings, maybe intake processes, maybe it's client conversations, whatever it is that you do and how you do it. Think about ways that you can incorporate identifying victims of stalking with intentionality. Okay, so let's talk about stalking within these other cycles of victimization. And really the big takeaway here, there's kind of 2 big takeaways. The first is Stalking is a little bit unique in those gender-based violence crimes in that we do have a large portion of our victim population that has no relational connection to their offender. They are abused, they are stalked by people they don't know or people that they barely know. That impacts what resources and support they get in their community, unfortunately. Because we sometimes in our community, we have emergency shelters, we have advocacy services, we have special courts, we have special processes for people who are being hurt by someone they know, right? Domestic violence. Even within our sexual violence, we recognize, oh, this needs a heightened level of response. But those victims of stranger stalking or acquaintance stalking can really, really fall through the gaps. So I say that just for you to do your own analysis of your community and your resources. How do you, as a community, respond to victims of stranger stalking? And if you respond less than you do victims of intimate partner stalking, it gives you some goals, right? It gives you some things that you can look towards in shoring up and kind of filling those gaps so we don't have those victims falling through. The other big takeaway when we look at these forms of victimization is that stalking, frankly, is just an incredibly effective way to carry out all of these other forms of abuse. Stalking is an effective way to exert power and control that allows an individual to facilitate sexual violence. Stalking might be used to collect information about a victim so the individual can engage in sexual violence. All right, I want to know where they park. I want to know when they're home. I want to know if they lock their back door, et cetera, et cetera. We see stalkers use the information they've gathered about a victim to solicit sexual violence from third parties, pretending to be the victim online and posting, requesting sexual violence from strangers. And strangers will absolutely answer that request, right? We see stalkers utilizing these behaviors after sexual violence to maybe try to mitigate or prevent any type of accountability or reporting that victim might do. We know with human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, stalking is incredibly effective, an effective way to carry out trafficking. When we talk about trafficking, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, we're talking about an individual who's using another human as a product, right, to facilitate or to make some kind of profit off of them. So stalking is really effective for traffickers to maintain that power and control over a victim. And we see that play out in a number of ways. Within domestic violence, one of the things we want to highlight first and foremost is that stalking behaviors can occur during the relationship, right? It's not just because somebody's having a hard time after the breakup. But we also know that intimate partner stalkers are the offenders who pose the greatest risk to their victims, right? They are the offenders who have the greatest amount of access to their victims, the intimate knowledge that they have of the victim, they weaponize against the victim. So that might be logistical, right? I know where the victim banks, right? I know where the victim lives. I know where the victim works. I know the victim's friends. I know the victim's family. I know what apps the victim uses, right? I know what streaming services they have at home. I know what their passwords are to their accounts. It might be kind of a combination of that relational and logistics. Not only do I know where grandma lives, but I know that the victim worries about grandma because grandma lives out on County Highway and there's no neighbors around. But I also know grandma will let me in because she knows me and she's always liked me, right? So we see that weaponization and that impact, it has the ability to cause real harm in the victim's life. And we see these cases, unfortunately, have really negative outcomes. Particularly with intimate partner femicide, we see a pretty close correlation of stalking behaviors in the year leading up to the femicide. So femicide is where the female is the victim in the homicide. One of the things I really want to emphasize relative to this data point, first and foremost, is the risk, right? The harm that victims are facing. but also that we can be using this and we should be incorporating this into any type of domestic violence fatality review team that we are doing. If we have any type of fatality review, if we are being intentional about looking at reasons or why, the whys behind homicides in our community, we want to make sure we are actively identifying and looking for stalking behaviors. Now, I have the court system here and other forms of victimization. And I'm not doing that glibly. I'm doing that very honestly. And I'm doing that from my perspective as a former prosecutor and as an advocate. And my logic here is I have never met a victim or, frankly, any party to a legal action who said, well, that was fun. That was really a great way to spend my Thursday. God, I would love to do this again. Can you sign me up? Right? I've never met anyone who has been part of the legal system who said, this is a really fun experience. The legal system is brutal. It can be unforgiving. It can be traumatic, right? It is intense. And we have to be honest about that. We also have to recognize that stalkers have caught on to that. And they are weaponizing the legal system. They are working together to weaponize the legal system. They are passing off tips and tricks about ways they can weaponize the legal system. So we want to be really, really cognizant of that. And it gets tricky, right? Depending on our professional role, there might be some things that we can do about it. There might be some things that are outside of our, scope of responsibility or ability, right? But we want to be having conversations and we want to be aware. We want to be aware of this methodology and be willing to name it, right? So we can think about all of the ways someone could be utilizing the legal system. I'll just give some quick or just like two general examples from the two, from civil side. We think about weaponizing the civil legal system. That could be protective orders. It could be bankruptcy. It could be family court, right? Divorce, custody hearings. It could be small claims court. Whatever the small claims filing fee is in your community. I don't know. Maybe it's $75. Maybe it's $150. Maybe it's $200. $200 to file a small claim in your civil legal system. To file a claim, does an individual have to prove that the allegations are real or valid or have merit? No. They kind of literally can file anything. If they will pay the filing fee, they can file a small claim, right? A civil lawsuit. If you are served with a lawsuit, if it's crazy, if it has no basis, if it has no merit, does that mean you don't have to answer it? Of course not, right? You are going to have to answer and respond to that lawsuit. And that means you're going to have to take time off work, right? You might have to find childcare. You might have to hire an attorney. You might have to pay court fees to some degree. It is going to impact your life. That's a really quick and easy way that system can be weaponized. On the criminal side, kind of a summation of the criminal side weaponization, I work with a law enforcement consultant who has had an extensive career investigating and responding to stalkers. And she talks about in her career as an officer, offenders show up to court, they don't show up to court. It's a mixed bag. She said individuals who were stalkers, who were engaging in stalking behavior, never miss court, right? They're always going to be there. They're going to be there for every hearing. They're going to make sure they're in the courtroom because now they have sanctioned access to their victim. They know the victim's going to be there. It gives them the opportunity to invade that victim's life, to be part of that victim's life, to communicate threats, right? It's an incredibly effective tool for stalkers when they have a case moving through the criminal legal system, even if they're the one who stands accused. So we want to think about ways that we can mitigate this as much as possible. And again, some of this depends on your role, what your professional capacity is. But just really what I would encourage us to do is to be creative. Be creative. Think about some of these hurdles or some of these struggles in new and innovative ways. The reason I say that is, and I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I will say the legal system as a whole is really bad at changing. It's really bad at thinking about things differently. Anybody ever worked in the legal system and heard a response from someone, a clerk, a magistrate, a judge, and the response is, that's not the way we do things, right? We live and die by routine and by, keeping things the same, the same, the same. Now, I will say a very small silver lining to the COVID crisis was it forced our legal system to get creative, right? It forced us to do things differently. But it's a good example that things can be done differently. We can change the way that we are engaging with the legal system, but we need folks on the ground, advocates, and I don't mean advocates from a professional perspective. I mean literally individuals who are advocating for change, right? Advocating for insulation for these victims. So you can think about things before court, during court, creating that insulation for victims, and then after court, right? There are stages, there are things that we can do, there are choices that we can make that can really help promote the safety for our victims. And hopefully, it goes without saying, but safety planning is crucial at all of these stages, before court, during court, after court, because we know that the stalker knows exactly where the victim's going to be. So literal safety planning, but also thinking about ways that we can create and mitigate the impact that this has on the victim. I will say, I know this maybe sounds trivial, but one of the most impactful things that we can do as a professional, no matter what our role is just naming it to the victim. And what I mean is saying to the victim, this kind of sucks, right? This is hard, or this probably feels unfair, or this is not a fun day. I get it, right? We probably all feel that way or have had those opinions, but if we don't express it, if we don't clearly communicate that, the victim might assume that we're kind of signing off on it, that we don't see a problem with it, that we don't really think that this is an issue. So communicating that can really validate that victim's experience. And now they're seeing you as a partner, right? Okay, Natalie gets it, right? She knows that this day is miserable. She knows that this is hard. And so it at least allows them to feel supported and to know that you can see that experience, that you can recognize what they're going through. It can do a lot to really de-escalate that stress that they're experiencing, to make them feel connected to someone in the system who's helping them. Okay, I'm going to catch up on questions and then we'll jump into the use of technology. Stock looks like we have one. I think it'd be helpful to start at an earlier age, elementary, having educational deep into social skills as part of curriculum, which I know there are some programs already integrated, but it might be important as year-round, ongoing, making stronger behavioral skills. Yeah, 100% totally agree. These, elements, these factors are part of social development. They're part of emotional intelligence, right? And that is an area of education that generally we are not focusing on with specificity. So I totally agree with you. I think that's an awesome suggestion. And I think things that we can do to start impacting and improving that emotional intelligence, that relational intelligence can go a long, long way and really helping mitigate some of these behaviors down the road, right? Instead of being reactionary, waiting until they're adults and then trying to rewire, trying to be proactive as much as possible, I think would be really, really helpful. So great suggestion. So the use of technology to stalk. I'm going to kind of wrap up our training here with this, and with kind of the full understanding, this could be an all-day training, if not an all-week training, right? There is a lot of content here, and there's also, this is kind of an area of stalking that's constantly evolving. It's constantly growing. So we want to dig into it a little bit, but I fully expect there to be more questions that come up, right? This will not answer every question you've ever had about tech facilitated stalking. I do want, at the end of this, I will plug you into some resources, but I do just want to empower you and encourage you. If you got questions, we'll try to get to them today, but maybe they don't even pop up today. Maybe they pop up next week or next month or next year, whatever. Please feel free. I hope you are encouraged to reach out, to ask the questions, to have the conversations. And when you reach out to me, it's not just me answering. I will plug you into much smarter people that we partner with relative to tech facilitated stalking to get you robust answers relative to this dynamic. But the first thing I want to address when we talk about tech facilitated stalking, though this is a vast, topic, It's also, it can be relatively simplified in that the first thing we want to do is shift old attitudes. Old attitudes told us things that happen virtually, emails, text messages, social media, whatever. Those things are less important. Those things are less impactful than in-person violence. A punch to the face requires or deserves more of our attention than tech-facilitated abuse. That was an old attitude, right? We know now, we know it from our data, we know it from our individuals with lived experience. The opposite is actually true. When we talk about tech-facilitated abuse, we see abuse that impacts the victim in a way that goes beyond a single punch, right? This is a form of abuse that kind of like rings out in perpetuity. There sometimes is no end to it, right? It invades the victim's life in incredibly intimate ways. It impacts their life in multiple ways, right? Professionally, socially. It can have real ramifications. So this is a form of harm we absolutely need to be paying attention to. We also used to have these attitudes, and I'll give us a little bit of grace. Maybe there was some truth to this X number of years ago, but we used to have this attitude of, gosh, well, there's no way we can prove it, right? There's literally no way we can prove who sent an email or who made this Facebook account. Again, maybe that used to be true, but we can no longer hide behind those excuses. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the technology to really be investigating this form of abuse and responding to it. So I just want to point that out there, making sure that we're coming to this conversation with a clear understanding. We think about the stalking categories of behaviors, right? It's not hard for us to imagine how tech can be used to carry out any one of these categories, if not multiple, right? And the short version is basically tech has just made it a whole lot easier for stalkers to engage in abusive behaviors. 30 years ago, stalkers used to have to like leave their house to stalk someone. Now they can be sitting on their couch, they can have a cell phone, and they can stalk someone in incredibly effective, terrifying, impactful ways. So it's just reduced the barriers for stalkers, unfortunately. We think about this kind of from two different perspectives, right? So when we talk about stalkers engaging in this form of abuse, we see first and foremost, maybe they're able to do it because they have ownership of some form of technology. That's a element that sometimes we just like skip right over when we are responding to victims. Victims maybe are coming to us and they're saying, oh my gosh, I think they're tracking my location. They can see everywhere I go, right? And we're like jumping 10 stones down the road. We want to make sure, and we're backing up to really talk about, when we look at devices, when we look at accounts, when we look at subscriptions, when we look at any type of service, particularly if that victim has been in a relationship with that stalker, making sure that there's not some form of ownership there, because that can easily and kind of quickly answer our question about how that stalker is gaining access. The other kind of way a stalker could be gaining access is that they truly physically access a device, right? They gain literal access to a device, a form of technology. So that can be through maybe I got your phone while you were in the shower. You didn't know that I logged into it and downloaded some software on it. Maybe it's an abusive relationship where the abuser says, you're going to give me the password to your phone and I'm going to check your phone every night, right? And the safest thing for that victim to do is to comply with that demand. And so the stalker is utilizing that technology to engage in tech-facilitated stalking. We do see, and we'll show some examples of kind of that spyware, things that stalkers might use or incorporate onto a device to gain information from that device. The other form of tech-facilitated stalking, where we see our law enforcement have a particular role in responding to that, is the excessive invasion of life using technology. So calling, texting, posting, using kind of crowdsourcing that harassment. And we're going to dig into some of these examples in just a bit if you've got questions about what they mean. Or the other element here is using technology to exploit a victim, right? Sharing information about them, doxing them, distributing non-consensual intimate images, impersonating the victim online. Those are all things, those are all kind of the big picture categories that we see when we talk about tech facilitated stalking. And like I said, I'm going to give you some examples of these if you're unclear of what that looks like or what that means. But that in general is what it looks like when we talk about what is tech facilitated stalking, what's considered tech facilitated stalking. We think about the big picture categories. So when we're responding to a victim of tech facilitated stalking, we first want to kind of break down or to think through, start to catalog what devices that victim's using, right? We kind of want to do a tech checkup. How are you using technology? And one thing I would just really point out here is it's easy for us to overlook some of the technology that we use every day, right? Of course, we're going to say, oh, my computer or my phone, but we may not think about the fact that, oh, my dishwasher actually has a Bluetooth functionality, right? My home vacuum cleaner has a Bluetooth functionality. It actually has an app. The streaming services that I use, or smart devices in my home, or gifts that I've been given, or particularly if we have shared custody with an abuser, maybe it's a former partner, gifts that have been given to my children, right? Old devices, devices that work in partnership, headphones, right? We don't think about all of these other elements sometimes when we're talking about devices in general. So helping them walk through and kind of catalog all of the things that they're using and how they're using that can be helpful for us to start to assess where is this point of vulnerability, or how is this abuser gaining access to the victim. So when we identify these devices, we want to think about each of those devices. The first step is to that device, is there some type of ownership to this device? What I mean by that, anybody who's ever purchased a tablet, what's the first thing that happens when you turn on your tablet? You have to register it, right? You've got to create an account. You've got to do all of these things. So if any of these devices was ever purchased by the abuser, if these devices are serviced or powered by an account, a cell phone account or internet access, if the survivor, if the abuser has access to any of that, those are the things that we want to identify, right? Because that gives them pretty quick and easy access to that device, just inherently as an owner. We want to think about devices that maybe have been left. Maybe the victim doesn't own it, but maybe particularly we see this a lot, mentioned earlier, but shared custody. Maybe it's like they popped in and they left their AirPods, right? They were here earlier today. We had a fine conversation, no big deal, but they just happened to leave their AirPods on the desk, or things like that. Things that we want to be paying attention to, and just, again, kind of opening up our perspective and helping the victim walk through our perspective of all the things we want to be considering. So we want to talk about ownership. Then we want to talk about access. Maybe we talk to the victim about ownership and the victim says, no, 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 never, never, never. They don't pay for any of these things. They didn't buy these things. These things are not theirs. They have no connection to them. Then we want to think about these devices. Did they ever have the opportunity to access these devices? Like, literally, have they been in the same room as your computer? Have you been around them when you've had your cell phone out? Things that create opportunity for that abuser or that stalker to gain access and gain information for that device. So again, these are just kind of some general questions that you can structure some of these conversations. That will give some guidance on ways that we can help identify, help destigmatize, and hopefully help promote some safety for that victim. Part of the purpose of these conversations is that the real harm from tech-facilitated stalking is oftentimes not the actual action that the stalker's taking. That's not a very eloquent way to say this, but my point is the stalker might gain access to the victim's Google account, okay? Maybe they know the password. Maybe they guessed the password. It really isn't that complicated, right? It's not that that elaborate. But they're not texting the victim and saying, "Hey, victim, I just accessed your Google account." They're texting the victim and saying, "Hey, I saw you were in Texas last week. How was it?" Right? Or maybe even a little bit creepier, saying, "How was the Holiday Inn in Arlington? It looks nice." Right? The victim gets that text message and the victim has no idea how they are collecting this information. So the victim is running through all of the possibilities. Were they in Texas too? Were they at the hotel? Are they following me? Are they tracking me? Right? And they're left with all of these open-ended questions, and it feels way bigger, way scarier than the abuser knew the password that you used on your Google account, right? That's still invasive. It's still bad, but that's not as heavy as all the universe of possibilities, right? So as supporters, as advocates, if we can help narrow it down and explain it to some degree, it doesn't take it away, but it can actually really destigmatize the impact it's having on a victim's life. So when we talk about these devices, when we talk about these accounts, there's things that we can do relative to securing these accounts. Our phones in particular, we want to think about if the offender had access to a phone, if the offender gifted the phone. There are things that we might want to do to kind of shore up those devices if the victim wants to continue to use them. So, sometimes we might be doing factory resets. Sometimes we want to think about kind of that compromise. Is it relative to the Apple account? Is it relative to the Google account? Or is it the device specific? Understanding that ownership component, right? How this can give an offender access or give an offender information. They can see things like the phone numbers that have been called. They can certainly disrupt service to the victim. They can potentially turn on location tracking with that ownership of the phone plan. So again, they have these opportunities to gather information about the victim, and they're not calling the victim and saying, "I'm looking at your whole call log," but they might contact the victim and say, "Why did your mom call you yesterday?" Right? Looks like your mom had a bad day. I see she called 4 times, or maybe they're even a little bit more discreet. Is your mom okay? Oh my gosh, how do they know? How in the world do they know? So we want to think about this promotion of safety too. I hope you guys are all aware of and familiar with the Safe Connections Act. This can be a really great resource for victims who are on an account with an abuser. And maybe because the abuser opened the account, pays for the account, whatever, the victim may feel like they have limited authority. And they may be told that, right? Maybe they've called Verizon or AT&T and they've said, "I'm sorry, you're not the owner on this account. We can't talk to you about it." The Safe Connections Act helps empower a victim to be able to leave a phone plan without a punitive response, right? Without charges, without fees. It can be really, really helpful for them. There are some qualifications to be able to access relief under the Safe Connections Act. That victim must have that attestation from a support worker, an advocate, an officer, things like this. But I just want to make sure we're all aware of this, that this is an option and that most of our phone companies have kind of like a designated portal for this. They have specially trained employees to deal with this and to respond to these types of requests. Okay, so when we talk about accounts, we're going to talk about logins. We're going to talk about the ways, the information that we're sharing on accounts, and we're going to think about all of the apps on a device in general. So we talk about logins. One of the things I really want us to consider is utilizing the security measures, utilizing the things that are already in place on a lot of our big accounts like Google or Apple. So this is an example of my colleague's phone. She has an Apple phone, but you can easily go into your settings and you can see things like who has accessed my Apple account and where did they access it from. That in and of itself can be very telling to a victim. Oh, somebody else is accessing my Apple account, right? that can be really helpful for us. Again, if we're just trying to identify what's happening and how it's happening, we can use a security checkup in both of these programs, in both Google and Android and in our Apple phones. These can be really helpful to walk the victim through their device and their account. They can walk through what apps they're using, how they're using their apps. All of those things can be really, really beneficial. The Gmail safety check is a really important thing to walk a victim through, making sure they understand what they've opted into or opted out of. So many times we are utilizing technology in a way that we don't even know we're utilizing it, right? Sometimes I think about a training I was doing last summer. It was when a certain social media app, they rolled out a new functionality and it showed a map, right? And I was doing this training, I think the day after they rolled it out, we were talking about this, and all of a sudden we were having a conversation in the room, and multiple people in the room said, "Oh my gosh, I opted into this map. I started sharing my location and I had no idea I was doing that," right? So sometimes doing these safety checks, just walking through the way we're using these apps can be really helpful for victims to say, "Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that," or "I want to turn this off," right? So, using the Apple Safety Check, that's available too. All of these live on our phone, usually easily accessible. When we talk about unidentified callers, we sometimes can feel like there's nothing we can do about that, right? What more? How can we dig into this? We're going to get a little bit, if we walk down that road a little bit too far, we get into kind of our law enforcement role. But in general, everyone, advocates, anyone, no matter what your profession, can help document some information about these anonymous calls that can be really helpful for us, particularly if there is later a law enforcement investigation. So we can look up the number, we can see what the carrier is. We can utilize trap call. I don't know if anybody has ever used that before. This is helpful specifically to numbers that have been blocked by *67. Some of you all might remember that from old school days, right? You *67 blocks your number. Trap call actually unmasks or unblocks that number. It is a paid service. I think it's $5, $10 a month, but it can be really, really helpful or effective if a victim is experiencing a high number of those anonymous calls, kind of experiencing those life invasion behaviors. Let's see. I'm going to move through that commercial really quick just for time. But that's just essentially a commercial explaining how trap call works. You can go check it out. You can click through that site. The nice thing about trap call is it unmasks the call without the offender or the abuser ever knowing that their call was unmasked. So they think that they're engaging in this behavior anonymously, but it actually is giving the victim a very robust database of all of the phone calls with the actual number that was called, when it called, how long the call lasts, and it will actually make a recording if your state allows for that. It can be really, really helpful, again, if you have some law enforcement investigations coming down the line. Spoofing, we certainly hear that a lot. If you're not familiar with that, here's a creepy commercial to quickly catch you up on what spoofing is.
How can you remain anonymous when you call someone? The best way is by using SpoofCard. With SpoofCard, you can change your caller ID to any number you want, so that the person you call will never see your real phone number. How? Simple. Go to spoofcard.com and buy as many minutes as you want to get your account and access phone number. To disguise your caller ID, follow these 3 simple steps. 1. Call the access number. 2. Enter the number you want to call. 3. Enter the number you want to appear as the caller ID. But there's more. You can change your voice to sound like a man or a woman, so not even your mom will recognize who's calling. Plus, you have an awesome feature that allows you to record your conversations for future reference. Also, you can use your account with our iPhone or Android app to make changing your caller ID even easier. Start protecting your privacy today at spoofcard.com. Change your caller ID.
That company is no longer in business. We're out here doing PR for creepy companies. Though they are not in business, there are plenty of companies that have taken that place, right? So we see spoofing happening. We see that creating some real struggles for victims, but we want, again, to be able to explain it to victims. This is not a person who's on the dark web. This is not a person who's jailbreaking iPhones. This is a person who paid $1.99 for an app, and doing so allows them to hide their number, disguise their number, or make their number look like something else, right? It doesn't change it. It doesn't change that it's happening. And I'm not trying to say that that fixes it, but it does destigmatize it a little bit, right? Because if you don't know what spoofing is, or you don't know how somebody does it, it feels like you're being targeted by this like criminal mastermind. It's not that complicated. I will also point out when we talk about spoofing, particularly when we talk about being able to pick the number that you want to appear, that functionality kind of ebbs and flows. It's not always available. These spoofing apps pop up, they get shut down, they pop up, they get shut down. It's like whack-a-mole. But if that functionality is there, if it's available, I want you to think about in your systems, your agency, or in your legal systems, if you are using text messages or phone calls, voicemails to communicate to victims, right? Here in North Carolina, we do text message reminders for court dates. If the abuser knows what number that comes from, right? It's going to come from a general number. They can spoof that number and send a text message to the victim to say, hey, this is the North Carolina court system. Your court date scheduled for today has been canceled. It's been rescheduled to a month later, right? Victim doesn't show up for court, that can cause some real harm and real impact to that victim. So think about that. If you are making regular contact with victims through some type of texting or phone, functionality, make sure that you're considering the potential that that could be weaponized from a spoofing perspective. Obviously, the use of location can be used via technology for stalkers to gain information about victims, to track their victims, to find their victims. It might be through apps. It might be through social media. I really would encourage you to think about beyond social media, all the other apps that live on your phone. Maybe it's a fitness app, right, that tracks the runs that you do or your walking routines or things like that. Maybe it's a delivery app that delivers groceries or food. Maybe it's a maps, right, that you use to navigate around. If the offender gains access to any one of those apps, maybe they know your app, your fitness app password, right? They can collect a lot of information. They can really learn a lot about physical location too. We talk about location tracking. Oftentimes you're getting questions about tracking devices, right? When we talk about tracking devices, we talk about them kind of in two different categories. One is a GPS tracking device, and our others are kind of our network tracking devices. When we talk about GPS devices, we're talking about devices that are communicating with a satellite. And so these devices, the information from these devices are a little bit more robust. It shows the history of the location everywhere that device has been, right? The service to that device is a little bit more consistent, but it's also a little bit more expensive. They're oftentimes a little bit clunkier. They oftentimes require like a subscription. So it's kind of more hoops for that stalker to jump through, right? We may not see these quite as often. Unfortunately, though, GPS devices are being marketed. Well, I say unfortunately only because abusers are going to use them incorrectly, right? GPS devices are being marketed for a lot of different reasons. This tagline always makes me a little uncomfortable in and of itself, but we see, GPS devices being developed for things like family location or pet tracking, right? I want to know where my cat goes during the day. The more the market expands here, we know that the cheaper the devices are going to become and the smaller that they're going to become, which means the more likely that they're going to be used for nefarious purposes. So something to kind of keep your eye on. This is an example of a pet tracker device that was being used to engage in stalking behavior. You can see this offender, they use some fencing wire to connect this pet tracker to a magnet that they bought at Ace Hardware and stuck it underneath the victim's car. You can see there exactly what that tracker says. Tag pet tracker, right? So we know that stalkers, we know that abusers are going to weaponize. They are going to use these for really nefarious purposes, something we want to be paying attention to. Now, we can also use that information to help us. With this case particularly, the one where the abuser had kind of created this little tracking device, That individual happened to be on probation. So when they found that tracking device on the victim's car, they were able, because this individual was on probation, they were able to go in and take a look at this person's computer, and they were able to find the pet tag account, right? Because it was downloaded on the computer, and they were able to find a very clear record of where the offender was using this subscription, this program to track this particular tag and everywhere it had been over the last couple weeks. So we want to be aware of these things. I know sometimes when we get into this portion of the training, it feels a little bit doomsday-ish, right? Here are all of the ways people can engage in really horrible behaviors, but we want to be knowledgeable about it because we can use those to really clearly kind of document and to show exactly what's going on. So to that end, when we are talking about GPS documentation, we want to think about things like computers, phones, and if we are down the road in some type of law enforcement investigation, we certainly want to be thinking about looking at some financial data that might help show the purchase of a GPS device or a payment to a GPS, like a subscription type payment, a regular payment, that service charge. That can be really, really helpful for us. And going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this training, telling the entire story, right? Making sure we're giving all of the details. So these AirTag, Bluetooth, what we call network tracking devices, those are a little bit different than GPS because obviously they're talking to networks, right? They're not talking to a satellite. So the information they give is a little bit different. It's just showing the location of that last ping, the last time the stalker took a look to see where the AirTag was, right? It's not giving that historical data. It is going to be reliant on the networks around that device, right? The device has to be around Apple devices or around Bluetooth devices. Now, maybe that limits the functionality, but I would say less and less so, right? The likelihood that your victim is going to be within 800 feet of an Apple device is probably pretty high, unless they live in an incredibly rural community and they have no Apple devices in their home. But the important thing here is that because this is talking to any device in its vicinity, unfortunately, we can't just tell a victim, oh, if your phone is in airplane mode, you can't be tracked, right? We can't tell the victim that their device will actually guarantee any type of insulation or security because it could be anybody's Apple device, anybody's Bluetooth device that is within the vicinity of the tracking device. I will say both Google and Apple, they are working hard to mitigate the nefarious use of AirTags or tracking devices. Both systems have alert functionalities on their phones. Apple's is automatically running on an Apple device, an Apple phone. Android has an alert system, but we do need to understand that victims have to opt in to this alert system. So they need to go to their safety and emergency menu. They have to go to unknown tracker alerts. They have to turn it on to allow alerts, and they have to turn their Bluetooth on. If they do that, when they do that, they might get an alert like this if there is a tracking device within their vicinity. So on an Android, it would look like this. On an Apple phone, it might look like this. Some of you maybe have received this at some point, right? Maybe because of some type of circumstance, you're with someone else for an extended period of time. You might get this type of alert. Now, when an individual gets an alert like this, you can tap into it, right? This is on an iPhone, and you get a little bit more information. It's going to tell you where that AirTag was first detected, how long it's been detected. It's also going to give you the option to use your phone to find the AirTag, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a bit. Oh, that's it. One thing I want to say before I get into that is, was that you mentioned you had received a notice like that, and it is scary. It's very unnerving. That's a really great point. You kind of teed me up here to say we need to be prepared, maybe ourselves to receive it, but also we really need to prepare our systems and our victims. Because if we wait to be first of all, this is going to happen. It's inevitable. You're going to work with someone who has this experience. If we wait to react to this, we might make some steps that could actually cause harm or risk to the victim. What I mean by that is if we don't have a plan in place, if we've never had a conversation with our partners, yeah, I will, Tina. We might get a call from a victim who says, oh my gosh, I'm driving down the road. I just got this alert. I'm freaked out, right? Understandably so. And they might say, I'm driving straight to your office, or I'm going straight to the police department, right? We want to be really careful about that because their location can be seen by the offender. And we don't want them to take a panicked response that actually contributes to a lack of safety for them. Because as we've already discussed, that might contribute to an escalation, right? An escalation in that offender's behavior. So have a plan in place. If a victim calls you in a panic, where are you going to tell them to go? What are you going to tell them to do? How do you want them to respond? Some examples I've heard from some communities across the country is they've picked a general location, and advocates have already talked to law enforcement and they all are on the same page. And so if they have this situation, they tell the victim to go to the county library, right? Go to the library, go to the grocery store. They've picked some type of generic location. And then law enforcement and advocates show up there to assess and support the victim. And the location in and of itself that the offender can still see doesn't give away any compromising information, right? So something to think about and consider what that plan might look like for your community. If you used your phone, if you kind of tapped into this thing that says find the AirTag, it's going to give you kind of a screen that I kind of call it a hot and cold screen, where it's going to show you if you're getting closer or farther away from the tracker. And you can use your phone kind of as a scanning device, hopefully, to find the physical AirTag, right? That's the ultimate goal. It's not a perfect system, but it's relatively effective. Now, there are some times that a victim will never get a notification, but they will literally just find the AirTag, right? So they might find an AirTag in their purse or in their car. If they do that, there is the ability to use your phone to scan that AirTag. And hopefully, if you've used your phone to find it, you've got the AirTag, you can scan it, right? So to scan an AirTag, once you've found it, if you have found the unknown AirTag, you can go to, on Apple, you go to that Find My app. It's a very confusing name for an app. It'll give you this option, Identify Found Item. Some of you might go to your Find My app and maybe it looks like this. Maybe you don't have anything on your account. So click into items and then swipe up on the screen and it'll give you the option to identify the found item. And then it's going to ask you to hold your phone over that AirTag. And then it's going to give you the serial number on the AirTag. And it's going to give you the last 4 digits of the phone number associated with that account. We want to make sure we're documenting this information, obviously, right? What we do after that can be difficult in terms of, it's going to give you instructions on how to disable it, but be cognizant about safety planning when you disable it. When you disable it, you're giving the offender notice, right? That AirTag doesn't work anymore. I'm just going to buy a new one, or whatever the case might be. Think about how that affects your safety planning, and think about what is the best next step for that victim. I mentioned, there is a likelihood that you might find an AirTag, a victim might find an AirTag and have never received a notice. And that's because a notification has some limitations. If the AirTag is associated with an account that is known to the phone, it's not going to pop. If it's regularly around, it may not pop, right? There's a lot of reasons why you may not get a notification. So we don't want to completely rely on that, right? We're never talking to a victim and saying, oh, you didn't get a notification? Don't worry. Then there's obviously no AirTags in your vehicle, right? We just cannot give that level of guarantee. There are some limitations to the efficacy of those notifications. All right. Stalkerware is kind of our most intense or invasive form of tech-facilitated stalking that we might see. I'll give you one more creepy commercial, and then I promise we're wrapping up here.
So, you want to keep an eye on your loved one or your employee because you suspect they're hiding something and it might get too late? How do you know where they are or what they're doing right now? Maybe they're not really telling you the truth about their activities or whereabouts. You are worried, so you wonder if the only way to find out is to know what they do on their cell phones right away. You know that's the only way to give you all the answers. What you need right now is a solution that lets you uncover the truth by secretly monitoring all the activities of your loved one or employee and lets you know their location at all times. Don't worry, there's a powerful solution and it's called Stealth Genie. The most powerful cell phone spy software work? It's simple. You install Stealth Genie spy software on the phone you want to monitor once, and you will not need to access the phone again. As soon as you install Stealth Genie, it will instantly start to upload all the information from the phone you're monitoring. You can view all this information straight away by logging into your online Stealth Genie member panel. You will remotely control the phone. You'll be able to record and listen to their calls, view their call history, SMS log, emails, contact book, appointments, internet browsing history, photos, videos, and instant messenger chats. Read iMessage conversations. Read WhatsApp conversations. Instantly find out where they are by tracking their GPS location. Even better, you'll receive alerts when they leave a certain area or enter a prohibited location. Receive instant alerts when a suspicious caller is calling or texting the phone. Stealth Genie is so powerful that you can even listen to the phone's surroundings from your member panel. And that's not all. There's many, many more features that Stealth Genie includes. The best part is they'll never know.
So that gives you kind of an example of how invasive those softwares can be. Now, Stealth Genie is also no longer in business. You guys will not be shocked to know the creator of Stealth Genie actually ended up going to prison for stalking. But there's plenty of softwares out there that will do the exact same functionality. So you can see how invasive that is, how effective that is. It does require oftentimes that physical access to the device. Sometimes that stalkerware can get a little bit more expensive too. So we're not seeing that quite as often, but certainly is a potential tool that a stalker could be utilizing. So there are some ways that we can remove it. Sometimes doing those factory resets can, or factory reset always does. Factory reset's not always super convenient for a victim because it literally wipes everything from their device and they can't just log back into their old account, their old Apple account, their old Android account and get their contacts back. They have to start from square one. That can be really, really hard. But sometimes we're seeing with stalkerware, literally turning your phone off and back on can remove that stalkerware and take it off of a device. So the antiviruses on computers can be helpful for that too. All right, so the last kind of element we're going to talk about is this non-consensual distribution of intimate images. Big takeaway here, I always just want to emphasize is kind of our biggest hurdle with this form of abuse is what victims feel like is a stigma or an attitude barrier that they will experience from helpers. They worry that if they report it, if they talk about it, that whoever their helper is, an advocate, law enforcement officer, prosecutor, whoever, is going to judge them and shame them. So they don't ask about it, they don't report it. And unfortunately, we see victims of NDII experiencing high rates of self-harm or death by suicide. So I would really encourage us as helpers, particularly because those attitudes, that stigma that victims are worried about is real. That is a common response, unfortunately. So I just want to emphasize the consensual sharing of intimate images. We all are going to have to start to accept that is a social norm. That is becoming a social norm. It is becoming incredibly common. That is not a one-off thing. It's not a bizarre thing. We also want to understand it is a social norm for all ages. We sometimes just associate that with young kids, but we see all ages engaging in this behavior consensually, right? Of their own free will. We need to kind of digest that. We need to make sure that we're not holding any stigmas about that we're not holding any judgment about that, so we can have space to receive those disclosures, that we can be a safe space to help and support. Because at the end of the day, offenders, abusers are banking on the fact, they are hoping that we as responders are going to have a stigma, that we are going to have judgment, that we will be unhelpful to the victim. They are hoping that that's the case so that they can continue to engage in this incredibly abusive, incredibly horrible form of power and control. We want to make sure we are not doing the stalker's work for them, right? And our response, particularly to this form of abuse. I do want to highlight some resources for us as we wrap up really quickly. Relative to non-consensual distribution of intimate images, these are some national partners that we work with that speak to this issue with particularity. If the images were taken before the victim turned 18, NCMEC down there in the bottom right, that ticket down can be incredibly helpful, but they do only work with minors. Our other resources there on the left-hand side will work with adults, victims of NDII as well. Oh, Lizette, good. I'm glad you had a good experience working with NCMEC there. So another partner that we work with really closely is NW3C. These are law enforcement professionals who can assist law enforcement with investigating and responding to tech-facilitated crime. And to that end, obviously, we're not getting into the nuts and bolts of how you investigate, how you collect evidence, how you present evidence. We know that tech-facilitated stalking is new and unique and impacts those three things particularly. So a new initiative that we will be launching here soon, I guess within the next month or two, is the National Resource Center on Cyber Crimes Against Individuals. So this is important for any law enforcement on the call, any prosecutors on the call, or if you work with law enforcement and prosecutors. It will be open only to those professions, but it will be providing detailed step-by-step training, resources, technical assistance relative to these cyber crimes that we're talking about, ways that we can investigate, collect evidence, and respond to these crimes. In general, though, I just want to highlight some resources relative to all the content we've talked about today. I mentioned at the beginning of this training, we have resources that are specific to a lot of different industries and professions. And we just want to encourage you to take a look at them. Hopefully, they will be helpful to you in the work that you do. You can plug your partners into them. If there's something you're looking for that you can't find, please let us know. We're always happy to help revise, adapt, create new things. We really want to make things that are accessible and relevant for you in the field. So we love getting feedback and hearing from what's working and what's not working for y'all. And as was mentioned when we kicked off this training here today, it's very appropriate here in the last, 7-8 days of January, acknowledging this is National Stalking Awareness Month, really taking this as an opportunity to elevate this conversation, to start partnerships, to start, incorporating new ways of doing things, new responses. It's a good kind of catalyst, a good reason to kick that off and to have that conversation. So I'm super, super grateful for all of y'all who have taken the precious hours on a Friday to sit and be part of the conversation here today. And I appreciate the very important work that you do and the willingness to learn and to take on new information and new ways of doing things. I'll highlight here our Victim Advocate Community of Practice. This is a virtual group that meets every other month. For any of our advocates out there who maybe want to have some connections, have opportunities to have some conversations about responding to victims of stalking. If the folks that were having some conversations here earlier today, some of that heartburn, those hurdles can be really, really difficult. This community of practice can be helpful for that, sometimes tackling some of those difficult things. Again, here's our site, and you'll get these slides. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if I can do anything for you. And like I said, it won't just be me. If your question is smarter than me, I will find smarter people than me to answer it. And hopefully we will help you do the important work that you do. So thank you again for logging on. I appreciate it. Y'all, please stay safe, stay warm. I did see one question from Hannah, but Crystal, did you need to do anything before?
Yeah, no, just quick last reminder. If you made it to the end with us, thank you for being here. I'm so glad we did this in 2 parts because so much helpful new information that's just changing so fast. Again, this will be up on our YouTube channel. We do have a follow-up email coming out. And that's it. We will see you back in February and maybe in March on Tuesday mornings for our Legislation in Action series with our CEO here at TASA, Rose Luda. And that's all for today. I realized it started freezing rain in San Angelo, so all of y'all
Oh,
stay
goodness.
safe and stay warm. I think it's coming for us. So,
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. Best wishes to y'all.
true.
And hopefully, and Hannah, that's a great question. And I think my short answer to it is I don't know of a lot of discussion about it. I would love to hear more discussion about it. I think you're onto something there, and I think it's something that could be really, really helpful. So it's a great point, and hopefully Tennessee will serve as a good example about how that type of functionality can be
Mhm.
helpful for us in responding to these types of crimes. So I appreciate you kind of raising that point, and like I said, hopefully we can continue to have bigger conversations about that, certainly.